Thank you, Richard Harkness. Now NBC continues its coverage of the invasion as we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And from New York, we bring you further reports on Allied invasion operations with Don Goddard.
This is Don Goddard with the summary of the hours up to this moment of this very exciting day, this historic day, the day for which the world has waited, D-Day, the day on which the Allied armies gathered in England under the supreme command of General Eisenhower have lashed across the Channel to bring the liberation of the peoples of Europe from their Nazi oppressors. Yes, it's the real thing, the invasion. Thousands of Allied troops, paratroopers, are spearheading this invasion, dropping behind Nazi lines to knock out that first line of defense. Overhead, the skies are black with Allied planes, dropping their bombs on every likely target, at every point where the enemy might launch the defense. And offshore are swarms of ships, as far as the eye can see, acres and acres of ships. Ships bombarding the coastal defenses. Ships bearing troops and equipment to back up the assault. From the NBC newsroom in New York, the news was flashed to a waiting world early this morning. First, the early and unconfirmed reports from German sources. Later, the first communique from the Allied Supreme Headquarters in London. That communique was broadcast direct at 3:32 o'clock Eastern Wartime this morning, the first official word. We have a transcription of that historic message, which we're now going to rebroadcast. Here is the first word, the first official message sent out to the world on the Allied invasion.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
That was a transcript of the first official communique issued by General Eisenhower's headquarters this morning. You'll notice that it tells only of an assault on the northern coast of France. There is no detailed word on the exact place where the principal assault is being made. No official word, that is. The Germans are insisting that we've made the strongest assault at Caen, 30 miles southwest of Le Havre. That fighting is very heavy and is in progress now along the coast between Caen and Trouville. And then there were the earlier German reports of fighting all along the Normandy coast, air and seaborne operations between Le Havre and Cherbourg. But of this, no official confirmation. German propaganda may, of course, be sending out confusing reports deliberately. We, for our part, will probably not give the exact locations of our assaults for some time. That would be information valuable to the enemy. For already we know that every attempt is being made to confound the Nazi defenders. We're using artificial fog in some places. Elsewhere, dummies are dropped by parachutes and planes, again to confuse the enemy, and so on. What we do know officially is this, that the Allied invasion now underway in full force is the greatest military operation of all time. A real test by arms, the decisive stroke to destroy the German military machine. It is the assault for which our men have practiced and waited, the great moment of invasion, the time of beginning for the liberation of Europe and the speeding of victory. General Eisenhower, in his order of the day to the invading troops, has said these words, I quote, "I have full confidence in your courage, your devotion to duty, your skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of the Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking." Those are the words of Commander Eisenhower. And other messages went out to the people of the conquered nations. Advice for them to clear the roads behind the coast, to resist the Axis, passively, without unnecessary risk, until the final word comes for them to rise up and strike. And the leaders of the conquered nations, they too have spoken, or will speak, during the day. General de Gaulle of the Free French Committee, King Håkon of Norway, giving advice, encouraging their people. I have just been advised that NBC's reporter Ed Hocker has just returned from the scene of the invasion assaults, that he is ready, will be ready in a few seconds, to bring you his first-hand report. So we take you now to NBC's Ed Hocker, who is in London.
This is Ed Hocker in London. Only hours ago, I saw the opening phases of the Allied amphibious invasion of Hitler's Western Europe. Trying to figure the thought picture in my mind's eye the events that must take place. Its magnitude is beyond my comprehension. Last night I passed a small mission bus, the 9th Air Force Marauder Station, where all day long I had a feeling that things were about to happen. There were more command cars in station. The MPs were everywhere. Officers, men, and the two correspondents present had been given strict orders to remain inbound. At 10 o'clock time last night, the commanding officer of the station, Lieutenant Colonel Tom Seymour, came in. He said he would be ready to fly in the morning. Norman, Gladwin-Hill of the Associated Press and I climbed to our seats, drove to our quarters, washed, shaved, and then went to the nearby officers' club for a snack. Tomato juice and coffee. A short while later, along with scores of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, we filed into the bright, smoke-filled briefing room. Colonel Seymour stood on a raised platform. This is what you've been waiting for, he said. This is invasion morning. The next hour and a half, Seymour and his gave us the information. Told us where we were going and why. What weather we could expect over the counter. What we were expected to do. Seymour then read messages to the boys from General Sam Anderson.
Because of a poor signal, ladies and gentlemen, we terminate this broadcast by Ed Harker from London. We return you now to Don Goddard in New York.
Sorry we couldn't get Ed Hocker a little clearer for you. He's just come back from the front. We may get him later in the day. But for those who may have slept through the momentous hours of this early morning, who failed to hear the first report, here's how the news of the invasion reached the world and how it was carried to the American stations of the National Broadcasting Company. At 12:37 a.m. Eastern Wartime, the German news agency Transocean broadcast that an Allied invasion had begun. At 1 o'clock, German DNB agency broadcast that Le Havre was being bombarded violently from the sea and that German naval craft fighting Allied landing craft off the coast. And at 1:56 a.m., the Calais radio said, "This is D-Day." At 2:31 a.m., spokesman from General Eisenhower in a broadcast from London warned people of the European invasion coast that a new phase of the Allied air offensive had begun, and then ordered them to move 22 miles inland. At 3:29 a.m. Eastern Wartime, the Berlin radio said that the first center of gravity is the city of Caen, the big city at the base of the Normandy Peninsula. At 3:32 a.m., Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force announced that Allied armies had begun landings on the northern coast of France. And at 3:40 a.m., the SHAEF announced that General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery was in command of the assault army, which comprised the Americans, the British, and the Canadians. And here's an eyewitness account by Richard Hutlet, representing all American news services. Said he, "I watched the first landing barges hit the beach at exactly the minute of H hour. I was in a 9th Air Force Marauder flying at 4,500 feet along 20 miles of the invasion coast. From what I could see," says Hutlet, "in these first few minutes, there was nothing stopping the assault parties from getting ashore. I spent about half an hour over enemy territory. We flew over and bombed some of the coastal fortifications, but except for some light flak from inland positions and from some type firing at us, we saw no enemy gunfire. The only other sign, says this reporter, the only other sign of life in enemy territory were some white and yellow parachutes dotting the ground where our men had hit. The weather was favorable to the operation, says Hutler. Other sources this morning have said that our bombers flew by a faint moon. Offshore Allied warships were bombing the enemy coast. They seemed to do it without any opposition. The Luftwaffe just didn't seem to be there. Says the Berlin radio in a broadcast recorded by NBC this morning, strong Allied air attacks have been launched in the Dieppe area now. That is farther east on the coast. And at least 4 Anglo-American airborne divisions have attacked the French coast between Le Havre and Cherbourg. That's what the German agency says. Mind you, this is not official from our headquarters as yet. That is a German report. And they say that glider formations also have been observed. Undoubtedly, they're being used, but we haven't any official word on it as yet. And now we hear that the Allies have fought their way inland, in some places as deep a penetration as 10 miles. The German news agency again says that Allied troops are battling now 10 miles inland from the coast of Normandy, where their first landings were made. And the German news agency also reports that the Allies landed reinforcements after the first wave of troops swarmed ashore. London says the first waves of shock troops and paratroopers went ashore between 6 o'clock in the morning and 8:15, that would be British time. They landed at several points along the coast of Normandy, between 90 and 100 miles below the south coast of England, the historic coast where England's big naval bases are. And back in Washington, General John J. Pershing, leader of the AEF in the last war, is confident that the Allied invasion armies will be triumphant. He issued a special statement early this morning. It was released by the War Department, and he compares the present struggle with the one he knew so well. He says, and we quote, "The American soldier of 1918, 1919, fighting in a war of liberation, wrote by his deeds one of the most glorious pages in American history. Today, the sons of American soldiers of 1917 and 1918 are engaged in a like war of liberation. It is their task to bring freedom to peoples who have been enslaved. And I," says General Pershing, "have every confidence that they, together with their gallant brother-in-arms, will win through to victory."
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for further reports on invasion operations, we take you to Louis Lochner at NBC in Hollywood.
And now NBC presents Louis P. Lochner, one of America's foremost European correspondents. Mr. Lochner's ability to interpret this morning's momentous news is based upon more than 20 years spent in the areas where the battle of liberation is now raging. Here is Mr. Lochner.
Good morning. Unless the Nazis have been deceiving the world in all their fishing expeditions for information during the past fortnight and longer, the frontal attack on Festung Europa is a military conception so bold and daring that even the German High Command probably did not expect it. We are evidently going to do the job the direct and hardest way. Therein, I believe, lies the best opportunity of success. Also, it is a good omen that the intuition corporal, Adolf Hitler himself, is reported to have taken over the supreme command. That is reassuring news, if true. If you recall what happened in recent days, you will remember how the Nazis first strengthened their defenses and reserves in Denmark, fully expecting us to land there. Then we heard of Rommel turning up in Yugoslavia, personally to lead anti-invasion movements there. Then again, there was the suggestion that vast United Nations armies were poised for attack in Sardinia, Corsica, and northern Africa to launch the major offensive in the south of France. But little was said in German pre-invasion commentary about a possible direct frontal attack from England on the western section of France. If it was mentioned at all, it was put off almost derisively as something that would easily be stopped by the forces under the command of Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Eisenhower evidently decided that the risk could be taken of making the direct attack upon that section of the vast coast extending from Spain to northern Norway, which must be regarded as the most heavily fortified. Our military intelligence must have reported vulnerable points, and it is to be assumed that for these points we are heading. I'm reminded of a visit to Hitler's Westwall or Siegfried Line in the late autumn of 1939. To us as laymen, the fortifications seemed formidable indeed. But with us was the former chief of staff of the Finnish armies, General Wallenius. I turned to him and said, "General, is the Westwall impregnable as our German guides have been telling us?" The general looked about for a moment to make sure none of our Nazi guides was listening in, then said, "There is no such thing in the military language as impregnable. Every fortification in the world can be taken. What you must figure out is the cost, and if you're willing to pay the price, you can take your objective. I should merely say that the German fortifications that we have inspected are formidable, very formidable indeed, but they can be taken." Later, in early 1941, I found myself in Greece. Again, we inspected a fortification system that was considered equal to any and every occasion. It was the famed Metaxas line. The Greeks and their Western allies seemed convinced that the line, with the mountains as their natural reinforcement and background, would surely hold. But the Nazi General Staff somehow found a way to crack that system. It discovered a narrow pass far down in the Struma Valley, I believe it was, and sent some daring men through it out of range of the Metaxas line guns far above. These daredevils, after making their way stealthily through the ravine below, climbed upwards and surprised the Greeks from the rear. Again, an illustration was given the world that a fortification system can be cracked. More recently, we saw in Italy how quickly the allegedly impregnable Gustav and later Adolf Hitler lines were blasted. All these earlier examples should give us a feeling of confidence that our invading forces have ferreted out the weak spots in the Atlantic Wall and will single them out for attack. By that, I'm not trying to minimize the enormity of our task. I was along the Atlantic coast of Belgium and France in June 1940, and a week or two after the Nazis had taken over, and then again in late October 1940. Then the difference between my two visits was colossal. Where formerly one gun had stood along the coast, my general impression was that now there were 3 guns. That was only a superficial survey, but it is to be presumed that the Atlantic Wall has constantly been strengthened and improved. One of Hitler's methods of trying to protect the Atlantic coast was that of running many spurs of railways out to the very cliffs facing the English cliffs. To the ends of these spurs, he hoped to run some of his heaviest guns. We saw some of them, enormous fellows, mounted on 2 flat cars each. Apparently, the plan was to have these located further inland at some focal point, and from there to hasten them in whatever direction they were most needed. Now, I doubt whether we need to worry very much about that particular feature of the defense, for the RAF and the U.S. Air Force appear to have done a very thorough job when day after day, week after week, they ripped up the railway installations of France and of Belgium and of Holland. I can't see Hitler's railway truck-mounted guns having very much freedom of movement. The initial reports all speak of the attack on the French coast, but General Eisenhower, in his brief radio address from England, significantly spoke of the cooperation with our Russian allies. The ensuing hours and days will probably bring front-page news again out of the Soviet Union, where evidently preparations have been made these weeks since the fall of Sevastopol for the next big offensive, wherever that may be. The Russians are obviously dovetailing their next effort into the great invasion. It is also a piece of careful timing that the American air bases in Russia are fully ready for action at this very moment. Hitler needs every facility he can command to meet the Allied thrust. That means also that he must have a constant flow of war materials from his widely diffused factories. I don't think I'm very far from the truth when I suggest that of late the hitherto safe regions of eastern Germany, of Poland and Czechoslovakia have been his best sources of supplies. For in the West, we appear to have done a pretty solid job of blasting. Now, the railway installations all over Germany have already been interfered with effectively the past weeks, and transport has become a major problem. In addition, shuttle bombing from Russian bases available to our air forces will now interfere successfully with further production. Granted that the Nazi armies may have vast stores of munitions in the West, that material goes fast in supersized invasions of this sort, and one nice day it will have been expended. Then what next? There's where the outstanding importance of the shuttle bombing comes in. If the factories in the east are blasted, one further vast reservoir of war material disappears. I said at the beginning that the place of our main attack probably surprised the Hitlerites, who could not conceive of such daring and boldness. Maybe we're also not wrong in speculating that the time of the beginning of D-Day may have surprised them, for the whole world was concentrating its attention upon Rome and the fight against the Nazi troops in Italy. Usually, after the taking of a world capital, a little pause sets in to take stock of the situation, to measure its psychological effect upon the enemy. But evidently the massed forces of the United Nations, ready for the main attack, are so enormous and are so well provided with all the innumerable things necessary to wage war successfully that the whole Italian show can go on without any relation whatsoever to what is happening in France. We may, of course, hear from Allied troops on Sardinia and Corsica as joining in the harassment of the Nazis in southern France. But as far as continental Italy is concerned, I can well conceive that General Alexander and General Clark are rendering the best possible aid to the Western invasion by keeping the 25 German divisions in Italy, or whatever is left of them, busy and bottled up. You've all heard Eisenhower and his spokesman warning the populations of France, Belgium, and Holland concerning the instructions which he will issue and which alone should be obeyed, and you have noted what stress he is laying upon keeping off the military roads. As one who followed the German armies on their blitz victories through the lowlands and France in 1940, I'm perhaps particularly allergic to that phase of Eisenhower's effort. The sad story back in 1940 was that the Nazis, with the aid of loudspeakers, sent on dashing motor cars into villages and smaller cities, and with the cooperation of venal quislings, managed often to convey the impression that the Germans were only a few miles off, when as a matter of fact they were great distances away. The purpose of these scare messages was to make the masses hysterical and to lure them out onto the military roads. Unfortunately, the Nazis succeeded but too well. This time it is to be hoped there will be no such confusion. Of course, the Nazis will do their very best, nevertheless, to issue conflicting and confusing orders. But let us not forget that the underground in the various countries has had time to perfect close-knit organizations. Preliminary reports indicate that the landing troops have been given the most formidable air protection in the history of mankind. If World War II has proven anything, it is that in this day and age, successful offensive presupposes preponderant air power. To gain that air superiority, the United Nations have not only stepped up production to fantastic proportions, but have done everything humanly possible to destroy as much as possible of the once colossal German Luftwaffe. The Nazis have been boasting of hoarding certain Luftwaffe reserves for our D-Day. Personally, I feel convinced that that is a gigantic bluff. Or, to put it more conservatively, whatever the Nazis may have, they will now be compelled to throw into the effort. And before long, we shall then see that those reserves are by no means inexhaustible. Once the Luftwaffe is knocked out, the German weapon will have been blunted appreciably.
You have just heard Louis Lochner speaking from Hollywood. We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for further reports on D-Day Allied operations, we take you to Washington for a report by Morgan Beatty in the NBC newsroom in Washington.
For more than 5 hours now, we've been covering the invasion of Europe, and all our reports up to now have necessarily been fragmentary. That is, our reports on actual operations. The most significant fact we have received to date is the absence of German opposition on highways back of the line. This inevitably means that the enemy is deliberately holding his fire, except for coastal defense and other prepared fires. He's deliberately sitting back, waiting to determine the magnitude of the Allied attack across the Channel. The Germans are well aware that the Allies have many more suitable choices for invasion around the coast of Europe. There's no point in their committing their major forces until they're sure where we're going to land, if we do, in addition to the invasion coast. But for the privilege of being sure, of waiting, of holding back, the enemy may be trading to us precious bridgeheads. He may well have been fooled, too, on the points of landing, because it's a matter of record that Prime Minister Churchill told the world at Quebec exactly where the Allies were going to land first. Here's what Mr. Churchill said then, and I quote him. "I look forward to the day when British and American liberating armies will cross the Channel in full force and come to close quarters with the German invaders of France. Whenever the great blow is struck, you may be sure it will be because we are satisfied there is good prospect of continuing success and that our soldiers' lives are expended in accordance with sound military plans and not squandered for political considerations of any kind." The preliminary reports detail the experiences of airmen last night attacking the invasion coast and of reporters who went with airborne troops over the invasion coast. This is exciting, dramatic, and tactically a very important part of the invasion plan. But the strategic plan itself, the main effort, really is the first 1,000 yards of beachhead at every landing point in France. The other day in Britain, they turned out another combat team at the United States Army Assault Training Center, one of the teams that today is battling its way through the first 1,000 yards of beachhead on the hostile shores of Europe. Some of the newsmen in England who are today with a combat team went along for the graduation exercises at that combat training center to see the demonstration of skill by these strapping American soldiers, the cream of the crop. The newsmen were cautioned that what they had seen in the way of training and weapons had been learned at a terrific price at Dieppe, Bloody Dieppe, Salerno, Tarawa, and in other landings. The secret had to be kept. This training, these skills of the combat teams, had to be hidden so it would come as a surprise to the enemy. But Colonel Paul W. Thompson, the commanding officer of the training center, was quite willing to reveal the general plan of these combat teams. We have, he said, a clear-cut, limited objective. We have devised a method of getting through heavily fortified beaches, beaches protected by artillery, beaches that are mined, beaches filled with pillboxes, tank traps, and other barriers. By using our methods and our training, our intelligence and our arms, we will take the first 1,000 yards. The first 1,000 yards. Everything depends on that. The first 1,000 yards is invasion. From there on out, an army has movement, has leeway. Perhaps most of us don't have the full picture of what's really behind that first 1,000 yards. The energy of 130 million Americans, 47 million British subjects in the British Isles is part of it. The vast resources of the greatest nations of the world. Invasion, you know, is war in 7 stages. The first stage is production on the home front. The second stage is transport on land and sea and in the air to the point of attack. The third stage is strategic bombing of the enemy across the water barrier that protects him from our land armies. The fourth stage is tactical bombing at the beachhead points selected for attack, the wrecking of the enemy's supply trains, his airfields, his coastal fortifications, and the towns he fortifies back of the invasion coast. The fifth stage of invasion is the landing operation, amphibious attack, the actual assault on the enemy's shore under fire. The sixth stage of invasion is the beachhead operation itself, the establishment of a foothold, penetrating perhaps 30 to 50 miles into enemy territory and sticking so that great armies can be landed with all of their vast gear. Then comes the final and seventh stage, the infantrymen and artillerymen dream about, the grim game of war, a game in which the armies move in strategic plays until one or the other is checkmated, finally, and is given the opportunity either to surrender or to suffer annihilation. Today, the combined Allied military and naval services catapulted against Europe the fifth phase of invasion. Already completed are those first 4 phases, production, transportation, and strategic and tactical bombing. More than half the battle has already been won. Yet all of this can go to waste unless this fifth complex stage in invasion is taken successfully, carried to a triumphant conclusion. And now I interrupt with a bulletin from London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill told the House of Commons today that an immense Allied armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller craft had carried Allied forces across the Channel for the invasion of Europe. The Prime Minister also said in his speech to Commons that massed airborne landings had been successfully effected behind the German lines. That is the beginning of a beachhead. On every hand, we're told that the establishment of a beachhead is a complex operation. But complex is merely a word indicating a delicate piece of machinery like a watch. What do we mean by the complexity of invasion? First, there's a strategic plan. It took President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin 2 years to get together on the question of when and where the invasion should take place, as Richard Harkness has told you a half hour or so ago. After that plan had been perfected, which meant that after 6 months had elapsed before the ultimate weight of invasion could fall, there was more to be done. And that meant that by June 1944, invasion could actually take place, and it's significant that June the 5th was the day. If the Germans could be battered into a punch-drunk condition, of course, by air attack, then diversion itself could become invasion. But anyway, the timetable was set at Tehran in the fall of 1943. That plan is being carried out, as Prime Minister Churchill told Commons today, at this moment, against the shores of Europe. Britain was chosen as the near base of operations. We cannot reveal the Allied plan now, but we can discuss the general way in which invasion is tied together. What makes invasion tick? It's very much like the principle of interchangeable parts in American industry, mass production. Suppose we describe a part or so. Supply, for example, is manufacturing, packaging, everything armies and navies need from spark plugs to smallpox vaccine, from watch springs to 16-inch guns. American and British factories have been turning out supplies for 4 long years. Presumably, there's enough to blow the Germans to kingdom come if it's applied properly. For example, Lieutenant Colonel Whitney Stone, commander of the Boston Ordnance District, tells us that 43 ordnance depots in the United States have been geared to General Eisenhower's Invasion Day plans. These depots are pouring a stream of guns, ammunition, vehicles, and spare parts into strategically located distribution plants in the United States. The Ordnance Department, says General Stone, is supplying 2,300 separate major combat items and 350,000 kinds of spare parts, parts needed to keep the machines of war in repair. The job of storing all this, of knowing where each item is, and of being ready to furnish battle equipment and replacement parts to some 70-odd different theaters of operations in all parts of the world is a gigantic operation in itself. But more important is the fact that we have the supplies for war, the supplies we did not have in 1941, and they are moving out to war in unbelievable volume and streaming across the channel. And for all theaters of operation, the most important of which at the moment, of course, is General Eisenhower's theater, Army Ordnance has more warehouse storage space than all the civilian warehouses in the country combined. They ship war out of these warehouses at the rate of $1 billion worth a month, $1 billion worth of anti-Axis fireworks. And how does this $1 billion worth of fireworks, together with everything else the Army needs, get to a war theater? That's the job of transport. There are all kinds of transport, air, motor, railway, but primarily there is ocean transport, ships, moving from the United States to Great Britain under convoy day and night. The supplies of war mesh into position from all of the United Nations, and now what happens in this meshing job? That's where the services of supply step into the picture, the Armed Service Forces. They're called the Army Service Forces now, and well over half our men are engaged in supply, from food to ammunition, communication, and medical attention, and so on. But transport is the big job. Our transportation service in Britain has been merged with the British transport services so that there's no disputing the right-of-way, nor is there any alibiing, buck-passing from one service to the other, any failure to keep invasion schedules. Nevertheless, the American Military Transportation Service has kept its own identity in Britain, and once supplies are run through the British transport system and put back into the hands of our forces somewhere in Britain, our services take hold again. Because of this double Anglo-American load, however, the transportation system of Britain has been running an average of 1.25 billion tons of freight every day in preparation for invasion. The canal system of the British Isles, a system perhaps you never heard about, is moving 1 million tons of invasion per month. Also backing up invasion, speeding it along, there's a fleet of 14,000 long-distance trucks, and the British railway system is running about 2,000 extra trains a week, special trains for troops and other invasion traffic. That's why the British government the other day appealed to the people not to make any journey of any kind that they could possibly delay. And once the trains have deposited the troops in the port, the whole business has to be reloaded into ships and boats. That takes more complicated planning than mere railway movement. Each ship is blueprinted, that is, loaded on paper first, so that all the space will be used, so that the weight will be evenly distributed, and so the right packages are put in the right places. Communications is another big factor in invasion. Communications hold an army together, repair its wounds. That is, if a whole unit is shot away, it's up to communications to patch up the gap and tie the main members together again. In the British Isles, the United States Army runs a full-time teleprinter system. And for the beachhead operation, short-range radio and telephone equipment, from walkie-talkies up to truck outfits, are all ready for the job, so the forward unit can talk back to the shore units in more ways than one. That's why you've been able to get so many dramatic reports from NBC reporters on the scene within a very few hours of actual invasion attack. Our military railway units in Great Britain have whole railway systems, collapsible boxcars and all, ready to run on the rails of Europe. But that's getting ahead of our story. That's part of stages 6 and 7 of invasion. We're now in stage 5, the toughest stage of them all, the job of taking that first 1,000 yards of beachhead. In another supply shed in Britain, I have seen a complete motor assembly line, just like the assembly lines in Detroit or Pontiac, Michigan. It's a repair depot where broken trucks and all kinds of motor vehicles, which are worn out, can be taken apart and rebuilt and sent right back into the battle again. We have also set up in Britain an air transport wing to ferry all kinds of planes to Europe and see that they're in fighting trim when they get there. These planes also carry strategic parts and material for the Army Service Forces. things needed at the drop of a hat. And all of this is a part of the business of getting a soldier ashore in a hostile area and advancing him that first 1,000 yards. Now, about the actual combat. As time goes by, hours, days, and weeks, the whole strategy and tactics of getting ashore on continental Europe will be revealed. At the moment, we know part of the story, that the air forces are blasting the daylights out of German positions. The airmen hope to prevent the enemy from hindering, from the air, our initial attack. There'll be plenty of transporting of troops by air to critical points, too, as the initial struggle gets underway. But the naval armada, the escorting ships, and the actual vessels of the invading forces all sail to a rendezvous in these invasion attacks. At that point, ships designated for the dash ashore are herded together like sheep under the guns of a special naval task force, all waiting for the 0 hour they've set. At that moment, they steam shoreward to assault the particular strip of beach they've been told to take. And in the very first ships are the Army's combat teams. They've been training for more than 2 years for this moment. The youngest, most athletic of our soldiers and Britons are in this small wave. They're all-purpose men. They're a small duplicate of a huge army, skilled in hand-to-hand combat, like the commandos, only with more specialized training, perhaps. We cannot tell you today just what these teams do, how they're operating to gain a toehold, but all the lessons learned through the spilling of blood at Salerno, Dieppe, Tarawa are in this app, seared in the minds of these men. They're the cream of the crop. They're determined and fearless. And before they landed, they knew they would set foot on beaches strongly fortified with artillery, mines, pillboxes, tank traps, and other barriers still more horrible. And each man, as he went ashore last night, had the equivalent of this order from his general. You have a clear-cut and limited objective. You will get through heavily fortified beaches. You will take the first 1,000 yards. And remember, there has never in all history been such a landing as the one you're participating in today. What you do will be written indelibly on the pages of history. For everything that has been done in America and Britain has been preparation for this hour, this moment. The production lines were set in motion for this. The planes have paved the way for this. The workers have worked long hours in factories for this. The Battle of the Atlantic was won for this. The whole vast organization of war has been organized, geared to this. You, soldier, are to take the first 1,000 yards.
You have just heard Morgan Beatty speaking from Washington. Now NBC continues its coverage of the invasion as we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York. As part of the NBC's network coverage of the invasion, we bring you now more late news from the NBC newsroom in New York.
This is Clyde Cattell speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York and bringing you a brief summary of the news to date. And we start with a bulletin. Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons today that an immense Allied armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller craft had carried Allied forces across the Channel for the invasion of Europe. And here's more on Mr. Churchill's statement. Mass Allied airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy lines in France, Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced in the House of Commons today. Landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points, he said. Well, D-Day is here. Allied armors that landed on the coast of northern France early this morning are already moving inland, beginning their march toward Berlin and the heart of Hitler's Europe. There has as yet been no official announcement as to where the landings were made. But German reports say they were carried out from Le Havre to Cherbourg, along the north coast of Normandy and the south side of the Bay of the Sands. It's just been announced that U.S. battleships are supporting the Allied landings, that our Coast Guard units are also taking part in the operations. And American Marines are in the fighting, too, manning secondary guns aboard the big ships. The land push was started by American, British, and Canadian forces, who received their invasion orders directly from General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander. The landing was announced at 3:32 o'clock this morning, when NBC listeners heard the official communique. And then followed the first eyewitness account of the landings, a broadcast by NBC's Wright Bryant. The landing operations were in direct command of General Sir Bernard Montgomery. The Nazis say 6 Allied heavy warships and 20 destroyers joined in the invasion effort. According to the Nazi claims, forces of the German Navy took on the Allied landing craft. Meanwhile, the War Department in Washington says American troops have knocked out pillboxes and other fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. The War Department reports that these troops, making the first attack on the western side of Fortress Europe, are specially trained and hand-picked units. They put into practice tactics which were perfected in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Overhead, as the Allied troops go forward, Allied planes are smashing at the enemy. The headquarters of the European Theater of Operations says Allied planes are, and we quote, hitting any target that has a bearing on the strength of the armies at the front. The report says that no target is too small. Flyers of the 9th United States Air Force are flying more fighter-bomber missions with more aircraft than any Air Force in history. Before the Allies officially announced the invasion, the Allied High Command told the French people a new phase in the air war had begun. The broadcast did not elaborate. But a broadcast to the Dutch told the people of Holland to evacuate their coastline at once to a depth of 21.5 miles. However, there are no reports on landings in Holland. On the Italian war front, Fifth Army troops are driving ahead this morning, still pushing northward against weakening German resistance. Our men have driven 5 miles beyond the Tiber River, and other Allied units are still going over that stream at several other places. The Nazis have apparently not left even rear guard forces behind as they retreat toward the Po River. The fall of the Italian capital, the eternal city of Rome, was memorialized last night in that address by President Roosevelt. And his broadcast was perfectly timed with the invasion drive of our armies into northern France. And of the capture of Rome, the President said, "That's 1 up and 2 to go." He referred, of course, to the fact that Allied armies still have Berlin and Tokyo to conquer. But the President warned against overconfidence, pointing out that final victory still lies some distance ahead of us. But Mr. Roosevelt declared that distance will be covered, that ultimate triumph will be ours. On the Eastern Front, land action is still on a relatively quiet scale. But the Russians are expected to strike out now to renew their drive toward the west, toward Berlin. There's been every sign of late that the Red Army was holding its divisions back, waiting for the opening of the second front in Europe. But that second front now opened, new large-scale offensive action is expected from the Russians. The latest word we have from Moscow, though, gives no indication that such a renewed offense has yet begun. The Germans continue to attack around the Romanian city of Iasi, and the Russians continue to beat them back, taking a heavy toll of enemy soldiers and equipment. In the southwest Pacific, our latest attacks have taken another chunk out of the Japanese fleet. In operations north of Dutch New Guinea, our airmen sank 1 Jap destroyer and left another sinking. Other raids were carried out over the enemy base of Truk. Our progress is slow but steady in the land campaign for the airdromes on Biak Island in the Skooten Group. Washington's attention will be divided today between the new drive in Europe and plans for a new investigation of the Jap attack on Pearl Harbor. A congressional investigation into that enemy sneak action has been proposed by Senators Ferguson and Chandler. It would be separate from any other inquiries made by the Army or Navy. The Senators passed a resolution urging the two services to make their own studies so that the facts may be recorded for any future trials of Admiral Kimmel and Major General Short, the Navy and Army commanders at Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack. Incidentally, Washington has 2 members of the Clark family making news this morning. While General Clark is leading his 5th Army north of Rome in Italy, Mrs. Clark is preparing to aid in the 5th War Loan Drive. She said in a United Press interview that she was excited and very humble over the news of the fall of Rome. But to do her part in the war effort, Mrs. Clark will leave in a few days to open war loan campaigns in the New England sections of the country. And that's the news up to now. This is Clyde Cattell speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York and turning you now over to Robert St. John.
At 37 minutes past midnight this morning, there were only 2 or 3 men sitting around the NBC newsroom. It had been a busy news day, but around midnight, things had quieted down. News editor Buck Prince and several men of his staff were having coffee and donuts. And then, at 12:37, the bells on one of our automatic news machines began to ring. Coffee and donuts were forgotten because bells mean a bulletin, and any bulletin might be the bulletin we were all waiting for, the bulletin announcing the invasion of Western Europe. But this looked like an innocent, unimportant bulletin at first. It was just some Nazi claim. But wait, it might be the tip-off on the big story. It told of a broadcast by the German Transocean Agency, a broadcast claiming that the Allied invasion had begun. The NBC network at that moment was carrying a dance band from Hollywood. The music was suddenly stopped. An announcer read the German claim. He was careful to state that this might be a phony. After all, it was from Berlin, and you can't trust Berlin. But on the other hand, it might be true. And so NBC's D-Day plan was quickly put into effect. Telephone operators got commentators and news writers and engineers and announcers on the telephone, and they came streaming in from all corners of New York and its suburbs. They rushed in by taxicab, by subway, by bus. One engineer couldn't find anything faster than a milk truck to bring him in. Now more and more German claims were pouring in over our NBC news machines. But still, silence from London and Washington. But in both places, NBC men were in action. In Washington, they were rushing out to the Pentagon building, the War Department's headquarters. In London, of course, the boys over there knew what was happening. 3 or 4 NBC men were out on the operation. The rest of them in our London office were standing by, waiting for the signal which would allow them to broadcast the greatest story of the century to a waiting world. I can tell you it was a nervous, jittery 3 or 4 hours here in the NBC newsroom while we waited to find out, is it true? Is it false? Is it the real thing? Or is it just another German claim, a German fishing expedition? 3 hours while we prated back and forth to these NBC microphones, bringing you bulletin after bulletin from Paris, from Berlin, from Vichy. Bulletins which we didn't know whether they were true or not. Bulletins which claimed that this had happened and that had happened, that planes were dropping paratroopers over Europe, that France had been invaded. But still, we didn't know. We passed them on to you for 3 solid hours there, warning each time this might be true, but it might be only Nazi propaganda. Calais radio at 1:56 said, "This is D-Day." We passed that on to you. A little later, the DNB German agency said that Le Havre was being violently bombarded, and that German naval craft were fighting Allied landing craft off the shore. We passed that on to you. We still didn't know. 2:31 a.m. And then we began to get a feeling that it was really the thing. A spokesman for General Eisenhower made a broadcast from London to the people of occupied Europe, a broadcast in which he warned them that a new phase of the Allied air offensive has begun. That's all he said. He said nothing about invasion. And he ordered them to move 22 miles inland. He warned them to stay away from roads, to stay away from bridges. And then, at 3:29, Berlin radio said that paratroop landings were being made on the Normandy Peninsula. And then, just before 3:30, a message came to us here in the NBC newsroom from London, telling us to stand by for a broadcast at 3:32 a.m. We knew what that meant. We knew then, finally, at last, after 3 solid hours of worrying, we knew at last that it was really happening. And then, at 9 seconds past 3:32, it hit. It hit the air. We sent you over the NBC network and all the affiliated stations across the country. All of them were standing by on a 24-hour schedule. We sent you the flash from Eisenhower's headquarters that Allied armies had begun to land on the coast of France. From then on, the news poured in, bits of news which gradually, from which we were gradually able to build up the picture. One bulletin, for example, told us that British General Sir Bernard Montgomery was in charge of the American, British, and Canadian troops who were making the assault. Well, if you have been up with us during the early hours of the morning, you know how we covered the story. H.V. Keltenborn came rushing in and gave you one of his unusual, his amazing ad-lib comments on what it all meant. We brought you Louis Lochner from Hollywood. We brought you Morgan Beatty and Richard Harkness from Washington. Here from New York, Don Goddard and Clyde Cattell filled in many of the details. And then abroad, over there in London, those men who had been waiting so long for the chance to get the air. David Anderson, one of our NBC war correspondents, came back to the NBC studios in London after having been out with the British forces, and he gave you an eyewitness account of what he'd seen. And then Wright Bryan, from Atlanta, Georgia, an NBC war correspondent, the first man to come back to make an eyewitness broadcast. He was with the paratroopers. And then there was Ed Hawker, who had been with the Air Force. And then there was John W. Vandercook, who was in the NBC studio in London. And then down in Washington, NBC announcer Holly Wright made an unusual broadcast from the Pentagon building. It was the first broadcast of D-Day made over any network. It was made over NBC by NBC's announcer Holly Wright, who gave us a color picture of what was happening in the War Department's headquarters. And then from Washington, we also heard the French minister telling in his dramatic, broken English what all this meant to France. And it's still going on. Right outside the door of this glassed-in studio, there are 8 or 10 news machines pouring in bulletin after bulletin after bulletin. Germany claims that she's doing this. Germany claims that she's wiped out so many regiments of American soldiers, sunk so many ships. But now we don't have to pay any attention to Berlin, because now the official, authentic story of the invasion of Western Europe is coming to us from Allied headquarters. The news that has come to us today from our Allied commanders in the European theater of operations is the news which all America, all the world, has long anticipated. It's the news which millions of Allied troops have been trained so long to produce. Through the long months and years of work, these millions of men have been pointing toward this very day of reckoning. Through the same long months, in all NBC news broadcasts, our first thought has been to bring to the nation, with accuracy and with speed, the deeds of our fighting men and the deeds of our allies. We have not overestimated the strength and the resourcefulness of our enemies. Neither have we underestimated the power and vigor and the ability in combat of our own American fighting men. In our own small way, we've made preparations for continuing to cover this biggest war news story of all, with accuracy and with speed. While American fighting men have been training in camps and in combat, here and abroad, our NBC reporters have gone with them. NBC's radio reporters have seen frontline action. They've landed with troops in beach assaults. They've been wounded. They've been hospitalized with disease. And they've recovered and gone back into action just as our troops have done. NBC reporters wear the uniform of the United States Army, and they are sworn to merit the privilege of wearing it. No NBC man has failed to accept his assignment, nor has he failed to complete the assignment. NBC's staff of radio newsmen is now engaged in covering this newest and greatest assignment of all. At NBC, we have selected able and experienced reporters, and we've sent them abroad. The Army, the Air Corps, and the Navy have assigned them their places with the invading forces. We wish them Godspeed and good fortune wherever they may be. On this network of 143 stations of the National Broadcasting Company, we are now standing by for additional developments, which we will pass on to you minute by minute and hour by hour as they happen. News of the invasion will take precedence over all network programs in order that the nation may be informed immediately of action on all fronts. Commanding officers of all the armed forces have given instructions that the American public be informed quickly of all invasion developments. We of NBC are pledged to perform our duty in bringing you this news. On this side of the Atlantic, at our newsrooms in New York, in Washington, across the country, in all affiliated stations of the NBC network, our feelings today are no different than the feelings of every American. We await the outcome. We pray for the triumph of our cause. We maintain our confidence in that ultimate triumph.
You've just heard Robert St. John, NBC commentator, speaking from New York. And now we present Alex Dreyer, the last American reporter to leave Germany before the war. We take you now to Chicago and Alex Dreyer.
This NBC reporter was stationed in the Nazi Reich through 1940 and 41, until some 14 hours before Pearl Harbor. I had gone behind the German armies as they swept through Belgium, Holland, and France, and I was on the French Channel coast when the Luftwaffe initiated the long, enduring blitz of London. Never had I seen such confidence, such cockiness, such surety of purpose, as was exemplified in the expressions of those Nazi pilots. There was never a doubt in the minds of those fanatical Germans that this was the beginning of the great Nazi empire, which Hitler had preached to them about so often. Back in Berlin, German civilians, tired of the war even at that stage, thought that the Blitz in Britain might bring the war's termination. When I left Germany on the 6th of December in 41, the retreats in Russia had just begun. The Nazis were just beginning to learn the bitter taste inherent in that butter of butters, butter for cannon. What is now happening in Western Europe is what the German civilian, contrary to the Nazi propagandists, has always expected ever since the Battle of Britain was won by the RAF. The Nazi can no more escape defeat than he can escape history, and no one is more aware of that axiom than is the average German. Poised against the Allied invading forces in Western Europe are some 800,000 to 900,000 Nazis positioned in the Low Countries in France. And in France proper, there are probably no more than 600,000 Nazis. The general area selected by the Allied command as the initial point of landing in the liberation of Europe lies some 100 miles from England. This is the Normandy coast, with rather fair landing places for our shallow draft landing barges. If the Le Havre area is now receiving the brunt of the Allied attacking force, it is appropriate for reasons other than those of general military strategy. This is the port where the British, in their hurried flight from France, left enough stores behind to feed a BEF for 5 years on the soil of Western Europe. I was at that port not long after the British had left it. I saw foodstuffs of all description. There was everything from Dole Hawaiian pineapple to California packing tomatoes. In the British officers' mess, dishes were still on the table, half filled with food, underscoring the hurried departure of the ill-equipped English. Now Allied armies are hitting back and in the same area. The Le Havre area is where I saw the Nazis assembling barges and boats of all description for an invasion of their own. At a Nazi officers' party in the summer of 1940, along that strip of France, a Nazi major boasted that the jewel which was England would be Hitler's inside of 10 weeks. That was when the famous Todt organization was constructing airfields so fast in France that even Goering at one time did not know the exact number of fields which were at his disposal. Planes of every type were poured into France and stationed at strategic points all along the coast. Back in Berlin, we foreign correspondents stationed in the Reich capital were told that we would soon be crossing the Channel as guests of the Nazi Reich in the invasion of another country. Now against the area from which the Nazis had hoped to launch their invasion, Eisenhower's forces of liberation are directing their initial weight. While the cliffs on the West Normandy coast are precipitous, the landing places are almost ideal. The distance between Abbeville and Le Havre is about 100 miles. This means that the Allies may be using the rivers Seine and Somme, which enclose that area, as natural defenses for their flanks as they press inward. The first German defense lines have already been cracked, and the men in those lines are the so-called do-or-die Nazis. And if we can judge by the initial reports, it would seem that a number of them have already died. In no other way could we have penetrated so deeply, so quickly, and maintained our position. It was at the Somme estuary near Abbeville that the Germans in May of 1940 first broke through to the English Channel, splitting the Allied armies in two. The break was followed by the surrender of Belgium, then the catastrophe at Dunkirk, and then the capitulation of France. The Allied capture of Le Havre would give the Allies one of the best harbors along the coast of France, and its support the Allies will need to furnish the necessary military blood, which is men and machine, necessary for the prosecution of the drive. Of all the ports held by the Nazis along the coast, Le Havre is the closest to Paris, only about 100 miles distant. Obviously, the Allied objective is military as well as psychological. With the fall of Rome as signified for the Italian campaign, the fall of Paris would signify on an even broader scale in the campaign now underway in the west of Hitler's fortress. And now, we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
You've just heard Alex Dreyer, the last American reporter to leave Germany before the war, speaking from Chicago. And now, continuing NBC's worldwide coverage of the invasion, we bring you a bulletin here. Berlin radio, monitored by NBC, today broadcast that the main bulk of the Allied landings took place in northeastern Normandy
and that the troops who took part in the invasion were mostly British, Canadians, and Americans. The object of these landings, the announcer said, was to set up airfields in the area. That is the latest word just over the wire, this mammoth military operation. Bulletin by bulletin, report by report, the big story is being built up. For many months, the National Broadcasting Company has been perfecting its plan for covering this biggest of all war stories. NBC reporters at this moment are gathering last-minute details at the official news sources at Allied headquarters. In Washington, NBC reporters are with the Allied forces now attacking, and we are expecting any moment to put our men on the air with their own stories. Meanwhile, here in the newsroom, reports are flowing in from the three great news-gathering agencies: Associated Press, United Press, International News Service. As each additional fact flashes through, we will have it on the air within a second or so. Our NBC monitors have their ears glued to enemy and neutral radios, listening for news from Berlin, from Paris, Stockholm, London. For full coverage of this world-shaking story, immediately and accurately, keep your dial set to NBC. And now we present H.V. Kaltenborn, the Dean of American News Analysts, from our NBC newsroom in New York.
Good morning, everybody. Let me give you the latest news as it has just been announced by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to the House of Commons. In summarizing what has happened so far, he says this: so far, commanders who are engaged in the invasion operations report that everything is proceeding according to plan. Massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind enemy lines, and landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at the present time. The fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled. Obstacles which were constructed in the sea proved not so difficult as was apprehended. There are already hopes that an actual tactical surprise has been attained. This is indeed good news. Good news because we had expected that these first operations would be particularly difficult, particularly costly in human life. And now it appears from this statement which the Prime Minister of Britain has just made to the House of Commons that the operations have been surprisingly successful, that the landings have been effected more easily than we anticipated, and that everything is proceeding according to plan. You know now that our first news of the invasion came from the Germans, and it was only several hours after that first news from Berlin that we received communique number 1 from General Eisenhower himself, in which he told us Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The section of France that is involved runs from Le Havre to Cherbourg. It includes a flat part of the Normandy coast. It is an area where airborne troops can be landed with particular facility. The landing is being carried out on this particular part of the French coast on an enormous scale, on a larger scale than some of us had supposed would be concentrated on any particular point of the coast of a single country. The fact that the fire of shore batteries has been largely quelled indicates the success of our great air invasion, which has been concentrating thousands of planes each day against this particular part of the invasion coast. We are told that an immense armada of upwards of 4,000 ships, together with several thousand smaller craft, crossed the channel. That is indeed an enormous armada, far larger than the one with which we invaded Sicily and later Italy itself. It indicates the enormous scale on which these operations are proceeding. We are told that 11,000 first-line warplanes are supporting the operation, a fact that is particularly significant when we remember that Germany probably has only some 2,000 first-line fighter planes and perhaps some 300 bomber planes available on the French coast to counter this tremendous air force. The invading forces were composed of American, of British, and of Canadian troops. They were commanded by one of the best-known generals of all time, Montgomery, of British 8th Army fame. The first waves of our shock troops swarmed ashore at several points on the Normandy coast sometime between midnight and 2:15 a.m. Eastern wartime today. They were aiming for the airfields on this flat area of Normandy of which I have spoken, for the seizure of airfields on the French side is one of the opening phases of the invasion operation, and it is the paratroops that were landed in such large numbers that are accomplishing that seizure. The Germans tell us that we have landed some 4 Anglo-American divisions of airborne troops already in this first phase of the invasion. Think of what that means. 60,000 men carried across some 80 or 100 miles of channel into France, almost within the first 3 hours of the invasion itself. General Eisenhower has sent an order of the day to his troops in which he calls upon them to meet this hour of destiny. He sent another message to the people of the occupied countries, instructing them how they could best help us. Already, scattered reports are coming in from the first actual contacts at sea. A small group of German destroyers was wiped out by Allied warships, we are told by an American observer. And the Germans tell us that a small vessel has been destroyed in the Seine, a German vessel, indicating that there has been some sort of a sea fight in the Seine estuary in which, evidently, our ships have been victorious. Landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points. United States warships, the United States Coast Guard, United States Marines are participating with our allies, the British, and with the French in these operations. The fighting has been particularly heavy in the area of the Seine estuary. We are obviously intending to seize the great port of Le Havre, which is one of the greatest ports in all France, beautifully equipped and developed, and which, once we control it, will enable us to land tremendous quantities of war supplies of every type. A broadcast from the flagship of the invasion Armada comes to us as a description of what that great fleet looked like as it was crossing the channel. The announcer said, "I can see 23 square miles of invasion boats from where I stand." If you remember that you must double that figure to realize what we have in this single armada, you can approximate the size of the invasion fleet now bearing down on the enemy coastline at this particular point. Well, assuming that there were 25 ships on each square mile, that would make it 1,150 ships in the single armada described by the observer standing on the bridge of the flagship. Fortunately, there is a moderate sea. We have the full moon. And another interesting point. We catch the Germans at a moment when their morale is low. Low because only 2 days ago our forces entered the capital of Italy, Rome, the Eternal City. And it is on the heel of that announcement that we get the news of the invasion. The landings on the French coast were varied in time in order that our troops might take advantage of the various tide stages at different beaches. The first landing times for the troops that went in landing craft varied from 6 a.m. to 8:25 a.m. British double summer time, which is midnight, to 2:25 a.m. Eastern wartime. The Allied forces, of course, have been ready for some time, but they were awaiting the best moment from the standpoint of weather, and all preliminary reports indicate that we did have good weather for the purpose of our initial landings. The Allies definitely control the air over the scene of operations. Obviously, the reason is our tremendously greater air power. But you remember that many of us thought that perhaps the Germans had been conserving a great deal of air power against the day of invasion. that they were not putting it up before, that they were endeavoring to deceive us as to their air strength. Well, so far, that does not seem to have been the case. So far, we control the air on that one day of the war on which it is most essential that we should. The Allied Air Arm is apparently now trying to land on such places of the Normandy coast as to help us, in connection with our landing operations, to pinch off the Cherbourg Peninsula, including the two good ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre. That is why we are making Normandy our first main beachhead, and why we are beginning to drive up the Seine Valley, up the Seine estuary, in the direction of Paris. Berlin tells us also that strong Allied air attacks have been launched in the Dieppe area. Now that may be an operation intended to deceive the Germans. Obviously, you will remember that Prime Minister Churchill told us that there would be rehearsals and certain operations that might be intended to deceive the enemy. We must expect these to develop. The essential thing is that the first actual operations where we did push them through have succeeded. The Germans tell us also that we use the device of artificial fog, which we have been developing for some time. The purpose of this is to conceal the landing boats as they approach the shore, so that the German coast artillery cannot get its proper aim. The Nazis also tell us that we use dummy parachutists. The purpose of that, of course, is to get the Germans to concentrate against some point where we are not actually landing our parachute troops, and in that way to make the actual landings easier because they will encounter less opposition. David Anderson, the NBC reporter in London, tells us that midget submarines of the Allied forces have been carrying out secret operations for the past 3 days. They have been placing markers on the invasion coast to guide our landing craft to the selected beaching points. And Anderson also revealed that under orders from General Eisenhower, all Allied planes went into action for the first time this morning, bearing the new insignia of United Nations aircraft. This was done to simplify identification. It is further evidence of the complete unity which the United Nations are achieving. It was announced from London today that General de Gaulle has arrived in England. He is there at the crucial time. Undoubtedly, his voice will be sounded sometime today, directed at the people of France, and his prestige with the people of France will be helpful in securing complete cooperation with every phase of the Allied invasion. It is interesting to go back to the very first news that came to us concerning the invasion, which, as I have told you, reached us from Berlin. And the Germans put it this way. Early this morning, numerous landing craft and light warships were observed in the area between the mouth of the Seine and the eastern coast of Normandy. At the same time, paratroops were dropped from numerous aircraft on the northern tip of the Normandy Peninsula. It is believed that these paratroops have been given the task of capturing airfields in order to facilitate the landing of further paratroops. The harbor of Le Havre, 80 miles from the British coast, is at the moment being bombarded by Allied warships. German naval forces have engaged enemy landing craft off the coast. The long-expected Anglo-American invasion appears to have begun. That was the first bulletin which reached us, and on the basis of the subsequent news that has come to us from Allied sources, we know that it is approximately correct. Fighting is going on at various points from 10 to 16 miles inland from the coast. That would be the approximate distance that Allied paratroopers would have to be carried in order to reach those airfields which are nearest to the coast. In cooperation with the landings, the leaders of the Allied nations have already spoken to their people. King Haakon of Norway warned his people particularly that there would not be any reason for them to step into the situation until they had further news, which indicates that probably Norway is not to be invaded in the immediate future. And the prime ministers of Belgium and of the Netherlands cautioned their people to await instructions. To sum up then, the invasion is well begun. The first operations have succeeded. It is going according to plan. The initial success has been greater than we anticipated. Good morning.
Ladies and gentlemen, as part of the NBC Network's worldwide coverage of the invasion, we have brought you H.V. Keltenborn, Dean of American News Analysts, speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York. We are preparing to bring you our own NBC newsmen reporting from the sources of this invasion story. You will hear their up-to-the-minute accounts from Washington, Britain, and elsewhere. Stay dialed to NBC for these latest details and for each development of this invasion operation. We are bringing you this big story as it unfolds here in the NBC newsroom, the crossroads of the news. Ladies and gentlemen, not long ago, President Roosevelt commented that the invasion of Europe might better be referred to as the liberation of Europe. At this moment, as that great task of liberation has begun, NBC brings you a sound which heralded the liberation of our own country, the ringing of the Liberty Bell. We take you now to Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
This is Independence Hall. I'm speaking to you from the foyer in the south end of the hall, the spot where the famous Liberty Bell has rested since 1915. The Liberty Bell will be rung by Mayor Bernard Samuel of Philadelphia. Mayor Samuel.
This great bell, which you are about to hear, was first rung in Independence Hall in 1753. It bears the inscription from Leviticus, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." Now through radio, let it indeed proclaim liberty throughout the land and the return of liberty throughout the world.
From Independence Hall in Philadelphia, we return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
And now as part of the NBC Network's worldwide coverage of the invasion, we bring you Robert St. John with more late news from the NBC newsroom in New York.
Here's a bulletin just in from London. Prime Minister Churchill told the House of Commons today that an immense Allied armada of 4,000 ships with several thousand smaller craft had carried the Allied forces across the Channel for the invasion of Europe. He also said that 11,000 planes, 11,000 first-line planes, made the original assault and softened things up for the landing forces. Churchill also said that massed airborne landings had been successfully effected behind the German lines. Here's another bulletin from London. DNB, the German news agency, admitted in a broadcast just a little while ago that a German vessel had been sunk during violent fighting in the Seine estuary. Another bulletin, the Moscow radio, in a Russian language broadcast, gave the Russian people news of the landing of Allied armies on the coast of France. The Russian broadcast, under a London dateline, reported the first communique from General Eisenhower's headquarters without comment. Here's a bulletin from Supreme Headquarters. German destroyers and German E-boats are rushing into the operational area off the north coast of France. That is the area where we're attacking. And the bulletin adds, no doubt those forces, the destroyers and E-boats of the Germans, are being dealt with by the Allies. German broadcasts said a furious battle between E-boats and Allied warships is raging off Le Havre. As the morning passed, observers on the England coast reported furious aerial activity. Bombers and fighters, that is, Allied bombers and fighters, of course, are crisscrossing the coast without a halt. There's sunshine in the Dover Strait right now, but the outlook is unsettled. There was a little shower about dawn, and then banks of heavy clouds started surging in from the northwest about mid-morning. The wind blew fairly strongly at night, but it lost some of its strength at dawn. There was a moderate sea. Visibility was good and improving. The temperature was was around the 60s. Now, that may not seem very important, but the lives of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers depend on that weather. Here's a bulletin from the Italian theater. French troops have captured Tivoli on the Avicenna Highway, 30 miles northeast of Rome. That announcement comes from the British Broadcasting Company. Oddly enough, the Allies learned their invasion lessons from the Germans, learned how not to conduct an invasion from the lessons of the Battle of Britain. Here's the story, because now, at last, it can be told. Actually, the invasion of Fortress Europa is the result of exactly 4 years of careful, very methodical planning. Into it have gone the best that free men can give, all their thought, all their ingenuity, their inventive genius. Yes, 4 years of planning have gone into this very moment when our men are fighting their way up the beaches of Nazi Europe. Hardly had Britain's army in France been snatched from the smoldering beaches at Dunkirk than plans for this moment were being laid. And we learned the lesson of invasion from the even blacker, even more bitter days that were to follow, the days of the Battle of Britain, when the hopes of free men clung by what proved to be a mighty stout thread after all, the thread of British courage. After the capitulation of Belgium and the Nazi breakthrough in France, Britain faced one of her darkest hours at Dunkirk. But darker days were still to come. For a long and aching period that seemed to spell the end of Britain, the tight little island had to content itself with defense, and defense alone. She knew that her troubles were far from over. She knew that the great test still was to be faced, and it came. It came in August and September of 1940, the great blitz on Britain. But the courageous few, the Royal Air Force, fought off the Nazi hordes and put the first big dent in Marshal Goering's arrogant German Air Force. And then the tide was turned. But stories that trickled out months, even years afterward, revealed how close Britain had come to oblivion, except for the RAF fighters. Those stories told how hundreds of German invasion barges had been caught and sunk by the RAF. Officially, both Britain and Germany kept silent, but it was obvious that Hitler had intended to invade the island empire. It was a hastily prepared invasion, and the hastily prepared plan failed. From it, the Allies learned their lesson. This failure of Hitler served as a warning that any spur-of-the-moment thrust at the continent was doomed to failure. That was the lesson we learned from the Nazis, the lesson that care, planning, caution had to be exercised if we were to succeed in smashing what the German geopoliticians called the heartland, Germany itself. And now, the moment is here, the time for fruition of these 4 years of planning, the H hour of D-Day, on which hangs the hopes of victory in Europe. And now here are several more bulletins. Bulletin from London. Swedish correspondents in Germany assert that the Allied invasion landings were made at 12 points along the French coast. The Swedish newsmen add that the central assault is now 10 miles inland at the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula. And the Stockholm paper Aftonbladet declares that the attack seems directed against the most heavily defended section of the French coast and is aimed directly at the French capital of Paris. And now here's a bulletin from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, London. General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, Deputy Invasion Commander in charge of ground troops, has just expressed overwhelming conviction that the present attack will succeed. Here's what he says. I personally have absolute and complete confidence in the outcome. The party is in first-class shape to win the match. We are a great Allied team, a terrific Allied team. This is the integration of the British Empire and America going out to battle together. I don't think any other two nations in the world could have done it. I don't know when the war is going to end, but I don't believe the Germans can go on much longer with this business. The German soldier is terribly good, but I don't think the German general is as good as he used to be. He's been on the defensive a very long time, and I believe it must affect his mentality. And now, I want to tell you just a little bit about General Montgomery. The Allied invasion of Europe opens once again the outstanding personal feud of this war. The feud between General Sir Bernard Montgomery, on the one hand, the commander of British ground forces, and on the other hand, Nazi Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German defense chief. They haven't met since about a year ago, when Monty Montgomery chased Rommel out of North Africa. That campaign was the one of the most spectacular of this whole war. The names of El Alamein, Tobruk, Benghazi, the Maret Line, all of those names are tributes to Montgomery's prowess. After North Africa, the general led his 8th Army into Italy. His interest has always lain with the Army since he graduated from Sandhurst 34 years ago. Sandhurst, as you know, is the West Point of Britain. Montgomery fought in France way back in 1914. He was wounded so severely that he was given up for dead. Ill health forced him into strict personal habits. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink. He eats no pork, no fish, no eggs. He's noted for his strict personal life and the strength of his willpower. It is his determination and self-confidence which will help carry British and American ground forces forward today. Now it's Monty versus Rommel once more. As a result of the great invasion operation now underway, the prediction is everywhere this morning, victory in 1944. And that was the assurance that General Dwight Eisenhower gave the public. It was his first public statement after being appointed commander of the Western Front. Remember? Ike Eisenhower is not given to predictions, especially ill-founded ones. I remember when I was in London, when he first arrived over there, and we had a very great deal of difficulty getting Ike Eisenhower to talk. But he attached only one qualification to that forecast of victory this year in Europe. That qualification was this: victory if every man and woman from the front line to the remotest hamlet of Britain and the remotest village of the United States does his or her full duty. That was Ike Eisenhower's challenge to the Allied home fronts. And that remains the challenge, for the Battle of Germany is far from won. We just began it this morning. Our fighting men are just starting on their way. They are only storming the outposts of the German fortress. The latest bulletins, as I've told you, say that they are 10 miles inside the front line. But 10 miles is only a small percentage of the distance between the English Channel and Berlin. Every Allied leader, every military expert of repute has given the warning in advance that the march across Europe from the west will be tough and will be very costly in lives. We've been told to expect that the casualty lists will grow to a length unknown in the first 2 years of American participation in global war. In this test of strength in Europe, the sacrifice may be high, very high, before the end of the battle. And yet those Allied troops on the beaches of France are now writing the biggest story of the war since the Japs attacked Pearl Harbor. This is the news story for which Americans, the British, and the Russians have been preparing together ever since Pearl Harbor. On that infamous date, you remember it, December 7th, 1941, on that date America was on the defensive, and so was Britain, and so was Russia on the defensive. The story of the war in Europe changed in the winter of 1942, and the United Nations have retained the initiative right up to this present hour of climax. The tide really turned at Stalingrad in Russia, where Hitler promised that his legions would stand forever, and where they met their greatest defeat. The other big war stories of the enemy losing his grip followed Stalingrad month by month. Such stories as Tripoli, Bizerte, Salerno, the downfall of Mussolini, the surrender of Italy, and now, just recently, the fall of Rome, the liberation of the first European capital from the grasp of the Nazis. And then came the news that the Nazis had been shoved across the border of pre-war Poland, that Russia had invaded Axis soil, Romania. Nowhere was the repeated German order to hold or to die able to stem the advance. In recent months, Allied flyers were adding new details to that other important news story, the destruction of Germany from the air. And we're going to see in the next few days or the next few weeks just how badly the Allied Air Force has wrecked Europe. We're going to see just how much help this softening up of German cities and French cities and Belgian cities, how much this smashing of railroads and airports is going to aid our invasion forces.
Ladies and gentlemen, as part of the NBC network's worldwide coverage of the invasion, we have brought you Robert St. John, NBC commentator, with news from the NBC newsroom in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
7:30 a.m., GRUEN, Gruen Precision Watch Time. Gruen Very Thin Watchmaking Miracle. WEAF, New York.
Which marks the launching of the invasion of the European continent, the thoughts of all of us turn to our loved ones who are fighting the big battle over there. The National Broadcasting Company has invited distinguished church leaders to help its listeners in concentrating their thoughts on prayer so that our men and women in the armed forces be given divine protection in their momentous undertaking. The first speaker in this special series this morning will be Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, the oldest Protestant church in America, who is frequently heard over most of these stations. Dr. Peale.
Let us bow in a moment of prayer. Almighty God, God of our fathers, we, thy people, bow humbly before thee on this fateful day of human history. As thou hast guided us and blessed us in the past, so give us now, we beseech thee, thy blessing. Bless the forces of freedom in the mighty assault begun this morning. Overshadow them with thy presence and undergird them by thy strength. March with them, O God, that the forces of evil may not stand before them. In thy might and power, let us prevail. This favor we ask in the name of humanity, and for the sake of the oppressed people who suffer under the yoke of Nazi tyranny. Bless thy servant, the President of the United States. Bless our allies. Bless the generals and admirals in command, that they may have a wisdom greater than human to lead this mighty invasion. Bestow upon them the insight of thy mind, and may the mystery of thy guiding spirit, as in times past, brood over the battlefields to give us victory. Bless the men whose lives are offered for freedom this day. Protect, preserve, and defend them, we beseech thee. Especially do we ask thee to draw near to those who must give their lives for God and country this day. In the hour of death, may Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, be close to them, to give them comfort and solace, and receive them to himself. Help them to know in their hearts that they die in the great tradition of American free men, and give them everlasting peace. Give thy comfort to all parents and loved ones in this crisis. Strengthen and undergird them. Thy mercy on thy people, Lord, and may victory come and a better world result from this historic day. This we ask humbly and sincerely through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Peale. Ladies and gentlemen, NBC has brought you this special message of prayer on D-Day by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York. Other distinguished clergymen will be heard later in the day.
Tuesday morning, June 6, 1944, and this is Don Goddard with your morning news on this day we will never forget. For this is D-Day, the day of invasion, and these last 8 or so hours have been amongst the most important in the history of mankind. Within the last 8 hours, the soldiers of the Allies have landed on continental Europe in at least 2 waves, perhaps more. The air fleets of the Allies have been shuttling death from the airfields of Britain to the armies of Hitler. And the navies of the Allies have been steaming in the waters of the Channel and hurling a great river of steel into the German defenses. And landing barges like scurrying water bugs have churned moonlit waters with ceaseless motion. Yes, the invasion is on. We learned about it first from an unconfirmed report over the German radio beamed to countries outside Germany. That was Eastern War time, 12:37 this morning. It could have been the invasion, or it could have been just another commando landing. But 3 hours later, Eastern War time, 3:32 a.m., the official announcement from General Eisenhower, communique number 1, they'll call it in the history books, confirmed that the invasion indeed had been launched. Here are the facts as we know them to this hour. The details are lacking, as you will see, as they must be. No precaution is being overlooked to protect our lads now fighting desperately for a foothold within the very walls of the fortress that Hitler has prepared with such care. In good time, we shall have all the facts, of course. Meanwhile, let's be patient. Historic communique number 1 said simply this. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The Germans say, for whatever it's worth, and it may be sheer propaganda intended to spread confusion, that we have effected those landings on a 75-mile section of the Normandy coast, between the mouth of the Seine River, westward to the port of Cherbourg. The Germans tell of a sea battle raging off Le Havre, there at the Seine's mouth. And later, German bulletins add that we had already landed reinforcements near Le Havre and were pushing inland. The Germans, again, also say that much of our strength is concentrated at the city of Caen, which lies 8.5 miles inland from the Normandy shores. Whether that action is by our parachutists who've been landing in swarms behind German defenses all morning, or whether it's actually a penetration from the sea itself is not clear at this moment. But this is the first action, and others will follow wave on wave. The people of Holland and all along the French coast were warned to evacuate a strip of coastline 22 miles wide to make way for this invasion. That was early this morning. That warning went out with the official invasion announcement and the publication of General Eisenhower's order of the day. This first strip of French soil chosen for our assault lies exactly across the channel from historic English soil, across from the great naval base at Portsmouth, the great port of Southampton, the ports of Dover, Brighton, Hastings, yes, Hastings, where William the Conqueror landed in 1066 in that other invasion, the invasion of England. The port of Le Havre, a great base in the last war and one of France's leading bases now, at one end of this invasion strip, and Cherbourg at the other, will give our armies excellent facilities for pouring supplies and reinforcements into the continent for the battles to come, once we have gained the foothold. This is not the easiest coast in the world to storm. High hills fringe the waters of the estuary, and German guns and fortifications frown from these heights upon the beaches. And how does the battle go? That's difficult to say from this distance at this moment. Several of the eyewitness accounts from reporters who first saw the landing barges nudge the beaches and saw our men scatter ashore under a roaring canopy of fighting airplanes and bombers, who saw them in the dim light of a bomber's moon as they followed the screaming rain of shells that came from the big battle wagons standing in the darkness out there on the channel. They all remarked at the ease with which most of those landings were made, and the general lightness of German opposition. They remarked, too, that the Luftwaffe was notable by its absence. The Germans, of course, are telling of wiping out bridgeheads and of savage fighting and making Americans prisoners, but a late DNB dispatch admits that Allied attacks are taking place rather deep inland now, and they tell of glider attack and numerous paratroopers, and they make one estimate that we've landed at least 4 divisions of airborne soldiers to this hour. That's German talk, of course. The Germans also speak of the great Armada that stands in Channel waters. In that, they are as right as rain. It is the greatest assemblage of ships ever to sail together. Prime Minister Churchill has just told us how many in his first statement since D-Day began. Says Churchill, 4,000 fighting ships and many thousand landing crafts and other vessels. 4,000 acres and acres of ships. Nothing like it has ever been seen before. 4 times as many ships in this initial assault on France as were used in the invasion of northern Africa. And overhead, Churchill tells us, roared 11,000 airplanes. Words are not adequate to describe this greatest operation of all time. We have one quote from a soldier who was there and came back, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Perigo of New York, who went over in support of the landing troops. He describes it this way. It's as black as hell on the beachhead areas. It's a scene you can't describe. You can see the flashes of those guns as soon as you leave the English coast. Troops are piling out on the beaches thick as seaweed. The Navy is banging away with broadsides. Our planes are all over the place, but I didn't see any Jerrys. Another soldier, unnamed, an American sergeant packing dynamite and destruction, looked grimly out into the darkness as his barge approached the landing. He set his jaw, and he exclaimed, "They can't stop us." And that, says the correspondent who went along and who stood by his side, is the way they all feel today as they face that biggest job that any army ever tackled. A bulletin from London. Swedish newspaper men in Germany have wired Stockholm that the Allies landed at 12 different places on the French coast. 12 different invasion points between the rivers Orne and Bière. At this point on the French coast, their spearheads are pointed directly toward Paris. And as the northern coast of France resound to the heavy boots of liberating troops, Allied leaders are speaking to their own peoples today, to the peoples of the occupied countries and to the world, heralding this greatest military operation in history. A few hours before the landings actually got underway, President Roosevelt spoke to the American people last night, referring to the Allied troops who were poised to strike, and doubtless the President knew that D-Day was at hand. Mr. Roosevelt said, speaking of that Allied victory at Rome, Germany has not yet been driven to surrender. Germany has not yet been driven to a point where she'll be unable to recommence world conquest a generation hence. Therefore, the victory still lies some distance ahead. That distance will be covered in due time. Have no fear of that. But it will be tough, and it will be costly. Those are the words of the President of the United States, uttered on the eve of the liberation of Europe. His broadcast was prompted by the fall of Rome, of course, but it was timed to coincide, we believe, with this later and greater operation. And here are two of the latest flood of bulletins that are pouring in here at NBC. The first from London says that the air war against Hitler's cities continues, even though we have 11,000 frontline planes blasting at the Atlantic Wall at this moment. The Royal Air Force struck deep into Germany last night, hit the railway city of Osnabrück. All of the British planes returned safely. And another bulletin from a photo reconnaissance base of the American 8th Air Force. Allied landing forces on the coast of France have established their beachheads, and they're slashing their way inland. The fact is plainly shown in photographs already brought back and developed by our photo reconnaissance men of the 8th Air Force. Leaders of 3 enslaved countries, Belgium, Norway, and Holland, went on the air in London to speak to their peoples at home today. King Håkon of Norway warned his people against premature uprising. In a broadcast heard here at NBC by our monitors, King Håkon said in effect, "Do not rise against the Nazis unless you're a member of the underground forces. And of course, if you are a member of the Norwegian underground armed forces, you have already been given your orders. But if you're just a patriot, keep under cover, ready at all times to aid when the need arises." The Premier of the Netherlands and Premier Pierlo of Belgium had similar messages. They urged their people to resist where resistance is possible, but they warned Belgians and Dutchmen against exposing themselves unnecessarily to Nazi vengeance. "The enemy will try to do everything to provoke you," they said, and General de Gaulle is also scheduled to speak to the French during the day. And from the commanding generals, General Eisenhower and Montgomery, we have some famous quotes, too, quotations that'll go down on that page in the history books. General Montgomery said as he embarked, "It will be a rough show, but it will succeed." And General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, issued an order of the day to his soldiers and sailors. "Soldiers and sailors, airmen," he said, "you are about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are far upon you, and the hopes and prayers of all liberty-loving peoples go with you. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But I have full confidence in your courage, your devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory." In Italy this morning, Fifth Army troops pressed ahead against the weakening German resistance north of Rome, and those Allied troops were heartened by their comrades in arms, by the knowledge that they already were fighting in the fields of France. And news of the Allied invasion of Europe echoed and re-echoed on the Eastern Front, too, along with that Russian frontier that the Red Army is expected to begin pushing to the west at any moment. The latest official word, however, does not tell of any Russian drive. And another bulletin, this one from Naples. Naples headquarters says that Allied troops, French troops, have captured a town 30 miles northeast of Rome, the town of Tivoli. British radio passes the announcement along to our monitors here at NBC. And today, all over the nation, special prayer and church services will be held. And here in New York City, one of the largest will be held this afternoon at 5:30 o'clock in Madison Square Garden. Madison Square, where Madison square where burns the eternal light as a memorial to the soldiers of the First World War. Mayor LaGuardia has called for a mass ceremony. Said the mayor, we can only wait for bulletins and pray for success. Said Mayor LaGuardia, this is the most exciting moment of our lives. And in all American hearts this morning will re-echo the words which Supreme Commander Eisenhower closed his message to his soldiers and sailors. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. This is Don Goddard speaking from the NBC Newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, earlier this morning, over most of these stations, a distinguished spokesman of the Protestant Churches of America, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, was heard offering a special prayer imploring divine protection for our armed forces on this day of the invasion of Europe. We are now pleased to present another leading clergyman who will lead us all in turning our thoughts to God in this hour of destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. David de Sola Poole, Rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York, the oldest Jewish congregation in America.
And in this hour of awe and terribleness, but not in fear, not in doubt, for we know that this dreaded D-Day is the dawning hour of doom for the demonic destroyers, the dawn of the day of destruction for those who have wrought devastation on millions of pitiful men and women and little children. Physically armed as are our sons and brothers, flocking to the invasion, and fighting as they are, men who are desperate, yet we know that their strongest armor is the rightness of their cause of liberation, justice, and brotherhood. And therefore, we turn to thee as the God of battles, certain of the outcome of this gigantic and bitter conflict. Strengthen thou our beloved warriors with clear conscience and with a high sense of dedication, so that, with unshakable faith in the justice of their cause, they may go forward, consecrated not to hatred of men, but to the love of mankind, and to the triumph of liberty over tyranny. Give them the strength to wage to utter victory this final battle against the blasphemers of thy name. May they rapidly and utterly overcome the ruthless oppressor, and thereby bring freedom and life to lands that have been crushed, to peoples that have been robbed, unspeakably outraged, and tortured. And make us, O Lord, in this land that smiles in peace, make us worthy of their heroism, their hardship, their sacrifice, so that when with thy blessing they come back to us in life, uninjured in body and soul, we and they may work together to build in peace, abiding peace for all thy children.
Thank you, Rabbi Poole. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the second special prayer broadcast offered by NBC on this day of the European invasion. You have just heard Rabbi David de Sola Poole of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York. Earlier this morning, prayers were offered over most of these stations by Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church in New York, the oldest Protestant church in America.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a part of NBC's worldwide coverage, we take you now to Washington and Morgan Beatty.
First of all, here's another quick news summary in the 8th hour of invasion news coverage. Prime Minister Churchill, speaking to Commons today, gave us the first detailed invasion information we've had from official sources. So far, he said, the invasion is proceeding according to plan. And, he adds, what a plan. And a bulletin just in from London says Allied soldiers have seized 12 beachheads on the French coast, beachheads which threaten to isolate the entire Normandy peninsula, and they're also threatening a railroad pointed straight at Paris. To get back to the Prime Minister, he says fire from the Germans' shore batteries has been stopped. And he tells us, too, there are hopes that our landings came as a tactical surprise to the Germans. In terms of statistics, he told Commons and the world that 4,000 ships, in addition to several thousand smaller craft, crossed the channel, and overhead
there were thousands of planes supporting the landing forces. And now I have a part of the story behind those 4,000 ships and the rest of invasion paraphernalia. A few weeks before the signal for invasion, the late Colonel Frank Knox sat in his office in the Navy Department here in Washington at a regular press radio conference. Before anybody could ask a question, he said he had an announcement to make that the United States today has the greatest seagoing battle force in the history of the world. We have more than 900 warships of the major types, which means somewhere between 5 and 10 million tons of fighting ships are plying the ocean ways of the world. Our Navy has the greatest air striking force ever known at sea, with some 25,000 planes ready to hit the enemy in any ocean at any time. When you realize that, we had only 17 battleships in 1941 and lost temporarily about half of those at Pearl Harbor. We had only 7 aircraft carriers and lost 2 of those in fairly rapid order. We had a pitiful 5,000 naval airplanes, many of which were on the way to obsolescence. And as for our Army, then, the growth of that force in 2 short years has been little short of a miracle. From 12,000 planes, only 500 out of them first-rate fighting equipment, we have gone close to 175,000. Before the outbreak of the war in Europe, we had an army of some 300,000 men. By the time of Pearl Harbor Day, we had managed to create an army of nearly 2 million. But today, we have close to 10 million men under arms, most of them fully equipped for battle, nearly 4 million of them not only equipped, but fully trained, ready for the command, attack. In Britain, the story is the same, only more so. How did all this happen? How was it that democracies organized the strength under a 10-year handicap to assault the fortress of Europe by sea today? Our kind of organization, built for peacetime manufacture of baby buggies, bathtubs, and washing machines, and so on, could never have switched over to war machines if the people behind the manufacturing industry and did business, if laboring people and housewives had not buckled down, if scientists, men and women, had not found ways to increase our output quickly. Much of this rapid turnover was a natural product of war. Radio and press played a part in telling us why we had to make sacrifices. So did the movies and lectures and libraries. Some of the turnover was long years of study and planning, such as General Louis B. Hershey put into the law that now selects men for military service, the draft. But in the end, it all boiled down to just people. People who had to carry through. I have people in mind whom I regard as typical ones in the war effort of both nations, Britain and America. I don't know exactly why I think they're typical, but I'd like you to know one of them, at any rate, possibly more. I think you'll understand why they're so important to invasion. One of them's a young American, Ben Marcelonis by name, a fellow whose father and mother came over here from one of the Baltic states about 25 years ago. 10 years ago, just after Hitler rode to power, although this is sheer coincidence, young Ben was busy in his father's workshop in Dearborn, Michigan. He was working on another one of those gadgets that exasperated his parents, because Ben's father never knew what would be missing off the family automobile next. On that spring day 10 years ago, Ben was working on a diving helmet. He had found an old hot water tank. He had, shall we say, borrowed the air compressor hose from his father's filling station, and his uncle had given him a hand pump. He completed his project on that spring day 10 years ago and reached the height of his gadgeteering triumph. He became the first youngster to walk underwater at his school swimming pool with the aid of his hot water tank diving helmet. Later on, thanks to the welding he had learned and the amateur excursions, Ben Marcelonis became an arc welder. All of this might have meant nothing at all to so important a project as a world war if it hadn't been that the war came along and they drafted Ben Marcelonis. That was okay with Ben, and ultimately he found himself where I discovered him last year at a bomber station in Britain. And one day last spring, Ben was busy musing over some gadget when up stepped Sergeant Green, a combat crewman. Green had been talking over a design for a gun mount in the nose of the flying fortress. The engineers had said it was impossible to beat the vibration in the nose, and as a result, the ME-109s were coming into the fortress blind spots too often for comfort. Well, Marcelonis didn't have any special materials to work with, so he went to the junk pile in the corner of his bomber station workshop. He found steel plates and some old steel piping, a lot of odds and ends. He cut out the plates for a base and welded the piping on, as he explained to me, at the right places. He spent a week of odd moments taking the gadgets to the bomber for a fitting. He'd bend a leg here and straighten another one there, and finally he got her in, and his bomber crew took her out. They made a killing of ME-109s that day that will long be remembered, because the news got back to the United States in no time at all, and the result was a gun mount in the nose of the fortress that today is blasting a path toward Berlin. Ben, the gadgeteer of Dearborn, a mere private, first class, at the time, received the Legion of Merit Award from Uncle Sam. Not just the regular award, but the officer class. Ben Marcelonis makes war possible.
You have been listening to Morgan Beatty speaking from Washington. We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
The National Broadcasting Company has brought you Morgan Beatty from Washington. Now, for additional comment, we bring you Larry Smith in the NBC newsroom in San Francisco. One moment, please.
Abreast of both the American and Chinese people of San Francisco, a new hope that soon the entire might of the Allied nations could be turned against our other mutual enemy, the Japanese. There was discussion, too, of the effect on the Russian bear, which sits on his haunches at the northern frontier of China, as well as on the boundaries of Japan's satellite, the Hirohito-spawned puppet state of Manchukuo. The first news caught the late street crowds, the sailors and soldiers and Marines, as well as the theater-goers, and the young couples, the men almost invariably in uniform. There was a sudden grimness in the air, a feeling that now the end of the European war was a matter of minutes almost. Victory in 1944, and that we could get along with our other job in the Pacific. Certainly not the true picture, but then these men in uniforms on the streets of San Francisco are bound for the jungles of New Guinea, for the Philippines, perhaps to Burma or India. To them, the war is in the Pacific. It seems the consensus of opinion out here on the Pacific coast that with the defeat of Hitler, the Russian might will be swung into the balance against Japan. I cannot help from recalling the toast of Vladivostok, where every drink of hot rum or vodka is toasted to Dairen, that modern all-year port on the Port Arthur Peninsula, which was handed to Japan in the peace conferences at Portsmouth in 1904, a gift to the Japanese militarism from Theodore Roosevelt. Russia wants the year-round ice-clear port as a Pacific outlet, and for the past 10 years, Russia, or at least Siberia, and Japan have been literally at each other's throats. I recall a Japanese war correspondent returning from Tokyo from the Kwangtung country, boasting that the unit to which he was attached had shot down 24 Russian planes along the Amur River. I have been sitting here listening to Tokyo's broadcasting station so far. We have not heard one word where the Japanese government have told the people of the invasion. But it is easy to picture the activities around the Gaima show in Tokyo tonight at the offices of the Foreign Minute, so closely tied to the military overlordship of Tojo, the military premier. It carries me back to that September night in 1940 when the three members of the Axis got together in a political, economic, and military dictatorship. So that's the picture tonight.
We return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged at this time to present the Reverend Francis X. Shea, Secretary to Archbishop Spellman, who will offer on this day of the European liberation a special prayer composed by the Archbishop. This will be the third broadcast this morning arranged by NBC in cooperation with the major religious bodies of America. Dr. Norman Vincent Peale of Marble Collegiate Church in New York and Rabbi David de Sola Poole of the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in New York were heard earlier in the day. Father Shea will now speak for the Catholic Church. Father Shea.
O God, Father of America, thou hast formed this union of states, sealing it with high destiny, that our nation be light to all peoples in their dark despair, light to all peoples in their fear of death, love to all peoples under their yoke of hate. For this destiny thou dost teach us to fly as the eagle, girding us with lightning and thunder, enriching us with treasures in field and fold. O God, bless America with thy shielding graces, lest we become a nation without light, our eyes turned from thee. A nation without life, our souls sundered from thee. A nation without love, our hearts forgetting thee. O God, give us victory that is just, merciful, and wise. For thou hast chosen America to be the soul of thy justice, the medium of thy mercy, the instrument of thy wisdom. Let all nations know that our justice comes from thy Spirit, our mercy from thy heart, our wisdom from thy mind, our victory from thy strength. Bless us, O God, with manifold graces to give freely of what we have, to give fully of what we are, in victory to give ourselves alone to thee. O God, the Father of all nations, hear our prayer for our united peoples. Grant guidance to our leaders, protection to our sons, and teach all of us thy way of life in goodwill and peace.
Thank you, Father Shea. Ladies and gentlemen, in recognition of the fact that the thoughts of all Americans today more than ever are turning to God, imploring divine help and protection for all our loved ones now engaged in the supreme struggle for freedom, NBC has offered this special broadcast as a contribution to the religious life of the nation.
This is station SBT in Sweden, calling PBS in New York. Hello, New York. Hello, New York. Stockholm calling. Place at 12:10 to
reveal that the invading forces had not found the German underwater obstacles as difficult as we had feared, and that the landings on the beaches are still going on. Which means that within 6 hours of the commencement of seaborne operations, the invasion of Europe has cleared the first hurdle. Not only that, but the progress has been so satisfactory in this initial phase that Mr. Churchill felt able to say, "We may have had tactical surprise." This is excellent news, but it's well to remember that the critical period of an operation on this scale is expected to last at least a week. The men are on the beach now, but until enough heavy equipment is ashore to deal with German counterattacks, we are not out of danger. We must expect those counterattacks momentarily. We may be cautious here in London this morning, but don't get the impression we're gloomy. Far from it. The strength that's been thrown into this operation is staggering. Mr. Churchill said that more than 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft have already crossed the channel. He told of the mass airborne landings behind the enemy lines. The Germans say we landed 4 divisions by parachute and glider, which may be somewhat exaggerated, but there were at least 20,000. And the Prime Minister gave another example of how many chips we have in this game by announcing that the Allied Expeditionary Force is sustained by 11,000 first-line aircraft, which can be called upon as needed. This is another fact of considerable significance. It's another way of saying that the Royal Air Force is prepared to put its night bombers into the sky by daylight if the need should arise. With the RAF ready to bomb by day in an emergency, we could carry out in any threatened area a bombing offensive without equal or precedent. The British Prime Minister wound up his short resume in the House of Commons by saying that
as the battle grows in size and intensity for many weeks, we will give the enemy many more surprises. The remarkably swift development of this first day is pointed up by the fact that Mr. Churchill felt it possible to make the statement he did only 2 hours after the Supreme Command here issued a cautious and vague communique. This communique said only that landing operations in Europe had begun. We're allowed now to release some more details on the action. In the first phase, before the landing, the weather was unfavorable. There were rain squalls and the channel was rough. But by each hour, the weather had changed for the better. And we're also able now to hand a bouquet to the men of the minesweepers who did a magnificent job in clearing the landing areas of thousands of mines under the noses of the German coastal batteries. The news of the invasion was originally broken by the Germans at 6:30 this morning, midnight Eastern wartime. There was no official word from London until 3 hours later. When the news did get around here, there was no dancing in the street. Nobody blew his top, nor is anyone likely to until the outcome is finally assured. We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness account of the naval action. Stanley Richardson reporting.
Scale military invasion operation in history.
Ladies and gentlemen, there must have been a momentary failure. We ask your indulgence. In just a moment, we'll try to establish contact with Stanley Richardson. One moment, please.
Not a recognizable enemy plane appeared overhead. At least no bombs were dropped at or on any of the ships in our area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessel, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up for some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap, and they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. We could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Terry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat based in daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships, which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore, while troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Literally miles of craft in even columns converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies, anchoring over heavy seas. You You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full, near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screens preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of each hour of the long-awaited D-Day. And right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our PT squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardment begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they looked to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here is Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces. Hello, New York. 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 Hello, New York.
Just one moment, please, and we'll bring you Merrill Muller.
Hello, New York.
They've got that. Go ahead, Muller.
Hello, New York.
The others in yet?
No. Hello. Oh, we've got some technical difficulty here. Cut this off the network for the time being if you're calling on this channel. Hello, New York. Hello, New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry because of technical difficulties we could not bring you Merrill Muller at his outpost there. Here in New York in the NBC newsroom, we bring you Elmer Peterson.
As you've heard from our reporters in London before interception was cut off, the invasion is moving ahead according to plan. We are finding the full fruition now of these patient months of preparation. The Germans are resisting. It was expected that they would. But our plans are going ahead. From neutral sources, we're getting steady reports of German claims of where the attack is directed. The Berlin correspondent of the Swedish paper Aftonbladet now asserts that the Allied invasion attack seems directed against the most heavily defended section of the French coast and aimed directly at Paris. This dispatch declares that warships of all kinds, including battleships, have thrown tons of shell at the coast, covering the landings. Other Stockholm dispatches from Berlin say that the Allies have landed at 12 points between the mouths of the Orne and Viry rivers on the Normandy coast, with a central assault directed at Caen. Large forces of parachutists, some of which were described as dummies, were dropped simultaneously in areas about 10 kilometers west of Boulogne and Cherbourg, the dispatches added. And here we have evidence that a great deal of deception undoubtedly will be used as this attack proceeds. The German High Command, in its first invasion communique today, said that Allied forces suffered particularly heavy reverses in the Caen area of northern France, and claimed that an entire regiment of paratroopers were destroyed in that sector. While an earlier German DNB, Deutsche Nachrichtenbüro news agency report told of new Allied landings on the Normandy Peninsula this afternoon, with tanks being put ashore in one sector. It's now apparent that our aim must be that of capturing large ports on the French coast in order to put ashore heavy equipment as soon as possible. There's another report that Allied troops, this report also comes from the German news agencies, that Allied troops have landed on the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey. Meanwhile, of course, we wait for the full results of what must be described as the psychological effect of the invasion on Europe, especially on the Balkan satellite countries and on the neutral countries. The very fact that the invasion has been started is significant. Much depends now, of course, on how fast the invasion proceeds. But the effect is bound to have a startling influence on the satellite countries, which at this time are seeing their final hopes of German victory dissipated. And here's a resume of the invasion so far. It's gone well in the first few hours. We've had Prime Minister Churchill's word that it's going according to plan. Our forces have been storming ashore during these early morning hours behind a terrific air and sea bombardment. American, Canadian, and British troops have seized beachheads, which threaten to isolate the Normandy Peninsula, also to capture a railroad pointed straight toward Paris. It's now known that American troops have knocked out enemy pillboxes and other fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, using the intense striking power which has been assembled during these past weeks and months, if not years. In addition, the German news agency says that Allied forces have battled their way 10 miles inland from the coast of Normandy. And the Germans add that the most important airfields in the Normandy area have been wiped out. This time, those airfields are being wiped out for the last time. The air attacks on those fields may have been remedied, but this time ground forces, heavily equipped, are taking over those airfields. Prime Minister Churchill reported on the progress of the invasion just 6 hours after the first waves of shock troops leapt from their landing craft, and after the first waves of paratroopers poured out of their great planes. Churchill told the House of Commons that upwards of 4,000 ships and thousands of smaller boats crossed the English Channel to begin the attack on the enemy's fortress Europe. One can only imagine the scenes on the English Channel as those thousands of ships, large and small, streamed across those waters towards the enemy shore. We've already had reports that thousands of planes are in operation. Churchill said the Allies can draw on the amazing total of 11,000 first-line planes if need be. One need only recall our first bombing efforts from Britain, utilizing no more than a few hundred planes, to visualize what this must mean, to visualize what it must mean in terms of tonnage of bombs now being dropped upon the enemy. It's doubtful, it would seem, that the German resistance can stand up against this form of attack. Turning to today's operations, Churchill said, and we quote, "Obstacles which were constructed in the sea have not proved as difficult as was expected." One reason for this, of course, is that the Allies sent out a great flotilla of minesweepers, those small vessels which have the difficult task of clearing away mines. The Germans had mined the waters heavily, but these men of the minesweepers did their task efficiently and effectively. It's also clear now that the fire of shore batteries in the invasion areas has been largely silenced. Many of these Nazi shore batteries, as you know, were cleverly concealed. Germans have been working on them for months. But it does seem, and largely no doubt because of the use of our great battleships, with their heavy guns pouring forth a steady rain of shells, largely because of this form of attack, we at last seem to have managed to silence some of these shore batteries at least. Prime Minister Churchill continued, as has been earlier reported, that massed airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy lines, and that landings on the beaches are proceeding at various points at the present time. It's not surprising, of course, that we are seeing this extensive use of airborne troops. It's been known for a long time that we would employ this ultimate of modern warfare, and we have assembled in Britain great numbers of these paratroopers using the most modern of weapons. Their task, of course, is to get behind the German lines if possible, to wreck communications, to destroy German fortifications wherever possible. And it does seem from these reports that the paratroopers are doing their job. Churchill also said, and we're still quoting, "There already are hopes that tactical surprise has been achieved." If true, this undoubtedly will prove to be one of the most significant parts of the invasion, for the Germans have had plenty of time during these past months to anticipate the aim and direction of Allied strategy. They have boasted that they knew exactly what we were going to do. They have claimed to be fully prepared. But in Churchill's words, it does seem that some tactical surprise has been achieved. So far, Churchill went on to say, the commanders who are engaged have reported that everything is proceeding according to plan. Here's another bulletin which has just come in. More than 640 naval guns, ranging from 4 to 16 inches in size, are bombarding the beaches and enemy strong points in support of landing forces. This is a remarkable indication of the extent to which sea power now is ranging alongside air and land power in this final assault, this greatest military adventure in history. It's been known for a long time that our Navy has been assembled for this task. But here, and I repeat the figures, more than 640 naval guns, ranging from 4 to 16 inches in size, now are steadily shelling the beaches and the enemy strong points along that 100-mile stretch of Normandy coast where the Allied forces have landed. And here's a report just in. The Paris radio said today that the battle on the continent, that is on the Normandy Peninsula, seems to be gaining depth. In other words, here is an admission from the enemy side that we are going ahead. Here's an interesting report from London. A few hours after the Allied invasion was announced, long queues of blood donors appeared outside transfusion depots in cities throughout England. The donors presented themselves in accordance with a prearranged plan to begin supplying a stipulated number of bottles of blood for the invasion forces in addition to their normal supply. It calls attention to one apparent fact, that is, that the invasion is going to cost us heavily, of course, in casualties, depending in the long run on how much resistance the Germans manage to offer. And now for a recapitulation. Churchill. I repeat, here is a recapitulation of Churchill's talk. Prime Minister Churchill told a cheering House of Commons today that the Allied liberating assault upon Hitler's European stronghold was proceeding according to plan. And he added, what a plan. Churchill was confident. He reported that the Allied forces had been transported across the Channel to the shores of France by an immense armada of 4,000 ships, with several thousand smaller craft, probably, said Churchill, the greatest fleet ever assembled. Churchill's also called attention to the fact that mass airborne landings have been successfully effected behind the enemy's lines. There are already hopes, he said, that actual tactical surprise has been attained. And, he said, we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting. The battle which is now beginning, Churchill warned, will grow constantly in scale and in intensity for many weeks to come, and I shall not attempt to speculate upon its course. Every report now coming in indicates that the actual air attacks upon the continent have hit a new high peak, with constant streams of bombers of every description dumping their loads on this chosen coastal area where our troops are attacking. French patriots have been warned by Allied radios to withdraw to a depth of at least 22 miles from the coast.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the National Broadcasting Company. We want to speak to you a moment about the program that was scheduled at 8 o'clock, the overseas broadcast in which we're to hear Stanley Richardson, the Navy, and Merrill Muller, our reporter at Eisenhower's headquarters. This broadcast failed because of technical difficulties, but we have been advised that the broadcast will take place in just 2.5 minutes at 8:25. So we suggest that you stay tuned here to NBC when we bring you this special broadcast of Stanley Richardson and Merrill Muller. And now again, Mr. Peterson.
In just a matter of seconds, as you've heard, we'll return to London for further direct details of the invasion. Meantime, here is some news from the other fighting fronts. In Italy, Fifth Army troops are driving steadily beyond liberated Rome. Some units have advanced as much as 5 miles from the River Tiber. They're meeting what's officially described as only weak resistance. French troops have captured Tivoli on the Avezzano Highway 30 miles northeast of Rome. And so, with the news of the invasion electrifying the entire world, there's new attention also to what the Russian armies now will do. The Germans are still attacking north of Iasi in Romania, trying to block a Red Army offensive in that area. We have had no reaction from Japan as yet, but it's clear that the Japanese now will intensify their campaign to break up the Chinese war effort. Gradually, the results of the invasion will have their effect around the entire world. The Germans have already admitted the loss of some of their aerodromes, and others, as we've already reported, have been knocked out by our air attacks and also by our land forces. German news dispatches claim that at least 4 Allied airborne divisions landed between Le Havre and Cherbourg, and that heavy fighting is underway around Caen, some 8.5 to 10 miles inland. The Nazis also declare that Allied glider formations have been observed, which seems like understatement considering the announcement in London that up to 4 divisions already are in active operation.
The National Broadcasting Company, through its own reporters where the news is made, through its monitoring of enemy and neutral broadcasts, through the worldwide facilities of the great news-gathering agencies, will bring you all the invasion stories first and as they happen. For a special broadcast now, we take you to London.
This is London. We now take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson. Hello, New York. We're having slight technical difficulties. We will try it again.
As you heard, ladies and gentlemen, we're having slight technical difficulties in establishing...
Hello, New York. We're encountering slight technical difficulties. We will hope to go ahead in just a moment or two.
Stand by, if you will, ladies and gentlemen. We're waiting for them to establish contact.
We regret that we are unable to establish contact with our remote point, so we must conclude this portion of the broadcast from London. We will call in the New York broadcasters again when we are prepared to go forward with this broadcast. We return you now to the United States.
And here again is Elmer Peterson with a roundup of the news.
Our own reports so far indicate that German naval activity has been negligible in the English Channel. The Germans, however, say that a furious sea battle has developed off Le Havre between Nazi motor torpedo boats and the invasion fleet. The Germans also claim to have scored numerous hits on warships, Allied warships, and Allied transports at sea. All these claims so far are without confirmation. It is to be expected, of course, that the Germans will use whatever navy they have left, especially their motor patrol boats and probably small submarines, in their efforts to block the invasion. Their only chance is to cripple the supply line across the English Channel. It also remains to be seen whether the Germans, as has been predicted, may attempt some sort of airborne landing of their own in Britain, some sort of desperate suicidal action in a final effort to break British railway communications directly from the fountainhead of the invasion supplies and the source of invasion manpower. There's new attention, of course, to the American paratroopers. These men have been trained for a long time in Britain now, and the forces now being engaged on the continent are studded with battle-hardened veterans of the Sicilian and Italian campaigns. These are the men who have landed behind Hitler's Atlantic Wall now to strike the first blow of the long-awaited Western Front squarely at the very vital parts of the enemy defenses. These paratroopers
are the toughest and wiriest men of the war. The actual sight, the actual scene of their assault almost beggars description as they cascaded from faintly moonlit skies in what must have been an awesome operation to watch. Large numbers of twin-engine C-47s, the sisters of America's standard airline flagships, carried the human cargo across the skies, simultaneously towing troop-laden CG-4A gliders. And all of this merged finally into a single sledgehammer blow, paving the way for the frontal assault troops. The paratroopers and our glider-borne infantry are armed with weapons ranging from the most primitive to the most modern. The paratroopers' mission, as I've said, is to disrupt and demoralize the German communications inside the Nazis' own lines. There is no immediate indication that their dynamite, their flashing steel, and their well-aimed fire was not succeeding in the execution of plans rehearsed for months in preparation for the liberation of occupied Europe.
This is the National Broadcasting Company in New York, and we are going to attempt once again to establish contact with Stanley Richardson and Merrill Muller. The special broadcast will come to you from London.
This is London. This is London.
Jan, we shall attempt to take you to a point on the English coast for the first eyewitness of the naval action. It is by Stanley Richardson.
We ask you to stand by, ladies and gentlemen. We are trying to establish contact, as you heard them say in London. Go ahead, London. Go ahead, Stanley Richardson.
Hello, New York. We are still encountering difficulties with this transmission and must again abandon it, at least for the time being. We return you now to the United States.
This is Charles F. McCarthy in the NBC newsroom in New York. The hour is at hand. The news the world has been waiting for is being made. Allied forces are moving inland, driving into the outer rim of Hitler's fortress Europe from landings made earlier this morning on the coast of northern France. American, British, and Canadian troops, airborne and seaborne contingents, were successfully landed in a series of operations starting at midnight Eastern War time and continuing for 2.5 hours. 4,000 ships and several thousand smaller craft took the main body of the Allied armies in. Earlier, deep penetrations had been made by parachute and glider forces. And a report from Prime Minister Churchill in London a short time ago says this, and I quote, "So far, the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. Allied leaders have not yet announced the locations of our landings. They want to use to the fullest extent whatever element of tactical surprise the Allies may have gained. But German broadcasts declare that our landings were made in Normandy, along a stretch of more than 100 miles of beaches that extends from Le Havre to Cherbourg. The Nazis say that the Allied aim is to seize the big ports of Le Havre and Cherbourg, as well as the airdromes of the Normandy Peninsula for a gigantic offensive. There is no denying the indication of gigantic operations, and NBC monitors picked up a British radio report a short time ago saying that our troops have moved at least 10 miles inland. We do know that the beachheads have been secured. That's an official bulletin just in from an 8th Air Force reconnaissance base, and the flyers have the pictures to prove those beachheads. They report that our men are slashing their way inland, but there's no official word yet on the extent of the advance. In addition to the support of warships for the Allied landings, 11,000 airplanes backed up the operation. Our Allied landing troops got their orders from the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower. The American leader issued his formal order in these words: "You are about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you. and the hopes and prayers of all liberty-loving peoples go with you. We will accept nothing less than full victory. NBC listeners heard the first official announcement of the invasion at 3:32 o'clock. It was followed by the first communique and General Eisenhower's order of the day. Earlier, the German radio had filled the air with invasion flashes. The Nazi broadcasts emphasized the size and scope of the landing operations and indicated that Allied paratroops were holding positions nearly 9 miles inland. The first Allied fighter pilots to return from flying over the beachheads report that our infantrymen were scrambling up the shores of France at 7 a.m. British time, 1 a.m. Eastern War Time. Apparently, they met no heavy opposition, at least in the early stage of the assault. In charge of the landing operations was the British leader, General Sir Bernard Montgomery. The Allied units leaped onto the shores that Hitler's leaders have spent nearly 4 years in fortifying. Our men struck out as Allied planes and ships hurled terrific barrages into those vaunted Nazi defenses. The forces thrown into the operation were by far the greatest ever used in an amphibious assault. All night long, London and other English cities resounded to the roars of thousands of airplanes, some carrying bombs, others carrying men. Returning RAF bombers met big fleets of flying fortresses on their way out. During the 48 hours previous to the landings, RAF and American bomber fleets dropped a staggering and devastating tonnage of bombs on the West Wall's defenses. One of the most difficult things on this D-Day is for us at home to grasp some idea of the immensity of the operations. Certainly, it is the greatest battle, the greatest military feat of all time. Prime Minister Churchill, in his report to the House of Commons, says as much, describes the mighty Armada that sailed against the coast of France as the greatest assemblage of ships ever to sail together. 4,000 fighting ships, ships of war, and many thousands of landing craft besides. And to sustain the operations, 11,000 aircraft. 11,000. Certainly a number that staggers the imagination. And then the Prime Minister utters these significant comments. Says he, "The battle which has now begun will grow constantly in scale and in intensity for many weeks to come. I shall not speculate on its course, but this I may say. Complete unity prevails among the Allied armies. There is a brotherhood in arms between us and our friends of the United States." And then the Prime Minister makes the first report on the overall progress of the battle. There are already hopes that actual tactical surprises has been attained. Churchill says, "And we hope to furnish the enemy with a succession of surprises during the course of the fighting." And as the eyewitness accounts come back from the front, we get this picture of the Allied soldier.
This is the National Broadcasting Company. We take you now to London.
This is the Advanced Allied Command Post. American war correspondent Stanley Richardson has just returned from the second front beachhead with the first naval eyewitness of the operation. Mr. Richardson. I've just returned from the channel approaches to the coast of France, where I was privileged to watch the opening phases of the largest scale military invasion operation in history. My ringside seat was the heaving deck of a United States Naval Patrol torpedo boat, on which I traveled across the channel with the first contingent of a naval task force. This force was composed mostly of American units. From the time we left the British coast until we were within a short 2 or 3 miles of the French shore, our naval units encountered no enemy opposition whatsoever. That, perhaps, is the outstanding fact that I brought back with me. Altogether, my squadron of PT boats was in the channel for about 20 hours. We covered scores of square miles of rolling, choppy sea. We were patrolling and acting as escort for literally hundreds of slower-moving vessels of all descriptions. Many of them had been at sea longer than we had, but the Germans either were taken completely by surprise or just were afraid to come out and challenge us. Not a recognizable enemy plane appeared overhead. At least no bombs were dropped at or on any of the ships in our area. No low-flying fighters came over to strafe us with machine gun fire. And no enemy vessels, not even one of their vaunted E-boats, came out to the attack. The officers and men with whom I rode wondered searchingly about this. They had been keyed up for some real German opposition, both from the air and the sea. Their trigger fingers were itching for a scrap, and they were a very disappointed lot at not getting it. If the Germans weren't just too timid to come out, the only other ready explanation that could be advanced was that they were too busily engaged in coping with the Allied air attacks made on their shore establishments as a prelude to the actual landing of troops. In the area we covered, we could see hundreds of bombers and fighters shuttling back and forth, dropping their bomb loads and returning to England for more explosives to blast the enemy. And we could see the big two-engined American transport planes, also in the hundreds, returning to their bases in the United Kingdom after dropping their airborne troops in France. Yes, Jerry had a lot to keep him busy last night and early today, but as far as the naval phase of our activity was concerned, not a shot was exchanged with the enemy while I was on the scene. For that preliminary phase of the show, at any rate, it was all too incredibly easy. We left our patrol torpedo boat base in daylight to accompany the slower-moving light advance guard of ships, which had to pave the way for the actual landing. One of our missions was to protect the Allied minesweepers, which cleared a wide channel straight to the enemy shore for our troop transports and supply ships. Long lines of ships of every description were discernible on the skyline. Literally miles of craft in even column converging upon the area in the channel marked for the concentration point for the actual invasion. Huge transports, tank landing ships, smaller troop landing craft, tankers and supply vessels of every kind, plodded doggedly along under lowering skies and laboring over heavy seas. You people at home would have been thrilled to the bone to have seen all these American men, American ships, and American supplies sailing calmly into the action for which they had been prepared and trained for so many months. It was estimated that there were more than 4,000 ships of all kinds in the channel for this combined operation. By nightfall, we were nearing the French coast, and our watch tightened. But nothing happened. Even when a full near moon, appearing fitfully from behind the clouds, gave our position away clearly to any enemy who may have been lying in wait for us. Then the fast and heavy combat ships moved up into position. All aligned themselves in the bombardment area to loose a hail of high explosives to protect the troops moving into the beaches on their landing craft. The warships started laying their smoke screen preparatory to shooting their guns. It was within only a few minutes of H hour of the long-awaited D-Day, and right there was where I got the biggest disappointment of my life. We turned around and headed back at high speed for the English coast. Our PT squadron was under orders to return to base and refuel for another mission as soon as its first operation was completed. So I didn't even hear the bombardment begin. But I can tell you that if things are going as well now as they look to be going at the time I left the scene, it won't be long before our troops have a firm foothold. And now here's Merrill Muller at the advanced command post of the Allied forces. This is Merrill Muller reporting from the advanced Allied command post of the invasion forces. Operations toward the liberation of Europe commenced just a few hours ago. Thousands of ships, both in the air and on the sea, and armies of men are in motion fighting the greatest military amphibious undertaking in history. The whole thing started moving when one man pressed a theoretical button some hours ago. That man was the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who thinks of himself modestly as a Kansas foreman. Every evening, General Eisenhower gathered his staff around him in his secret headquarters, studied their faces, and asked their opinions. A gale had already roughened the channel, but the staff was confident on the winds, tide, and weather of today, suiting an amphibious assault upon Europe. That was it. General Eisenhower wished his commanders luck, and the great undertaking then and there began to unfold. The finest collection of military minds in the United Nations had created a plan they considered complete. Every possible contingency had been thought of. A tremendous mass of the greatest military equipment ever devised had been pooled by the Allied attacking forces. A bombardment, the likes of which the world has never seen, was ready to open. Everything that could humanly be done had been done up to the point when General Ike pushed the button. The campaign thus passed to the direction of God and the hands of the common soldier. Early Monday morning, as the huge invasion force made last-minute preparations, General Eisenhower checked his decision again with his staff. The word was still go. Good weather was the prediction for H-hour D-Day. The dominating air support depends on good weather even more than the Allied navies. While landing craft of all types swung in and out of convoys to check their loadings and replace used fuel, General Eisenhower was busy doing the things he wanted to do, the only things he could do, visit his troops. As H-hour D-Day approaches, there is nothing more tactically useless than a supreme commander, except as an inspiration. General Ike is certainly that. I have never seen him more popular with his troops. I have never seen any commander receive greater acclaim or buoy his men more than does General Eisenhower. One British battalion cheered him as they clanked aboard their fast landing barge. He waved a friendly hello, and that broad grin lit up his face, a face that showed nothing but confidence in his men, a face in which fatigue is miraculously erased whenever it mirrors the Allied esprit de corps and the fighting spirit of the little men with rifle and bayonet. He came back from the port full of a sense of victory. No finer force ever went into battle with a better spirit or with greater courage than this one that General Eisenhower heads. In visiting with Royal and American Navy landing craft and with the Allied troops they will carry, the general had been given a lift. Some of his own nervous tension had been relieved. So he arrived at our hidden camp to meet the 4 correspondents attached to his staff. If I never attend another press conference in my life, I shall certainly remember this one. Perhaps because its outstanding factor was that it was more like a staff conference than a general's talk to newspapermen. Here's the picture. Remember that all around us, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were readying themselves for the outbreak of the battle that all the world had waited for 4 long, dark years.
Ladies and gentlemen, the prayer of the President of the United States. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness to their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. The enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tried by night and by day, without rest, till the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. These are men lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise, and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Many people have urged that I call the nation into a single day of special prayer. But because the road is long and the desire is great, I ask that our people devote themselves in continuance of prayer. As we rise to each new day, and again, when each day is spent, let words of prayer be on our lips, invoking thy help to our efforts. Give us strength, too, strength in our daily tasks, to redouble the contributions we make in the physical and material support of our armed forces. And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons, wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters, of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. With thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemies. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen. That is the prayer in which the President of the United States has asked us to join him as he leads us at 10 o'clock this evening over the radio. And now a few news bulletins that have just come in. A bulletin from London. The Nazi-operated Vichy radio reported tonight that compact masses, that's in quotation marks, compact masses of Allied planes are bombing the Calais and Dunkirk regions of the French invasion coast. That's some 125 miles to the east of the landings made at Le Havre this morning. It means that our beachheads are expanding, that we are going to different portions of the coast. Dunkirk, of course, and Calais are nearest to the English coast. The German radio reports that Allied paratroopers have landed just across the channel from England, there in the Boulogne-Calais area, that those paratroopers have occupied an enemy airdrome there. If that is true, and there is no reason to believe the Germans would put out a false report of that nature, it means an Allied invasion thrust directly across the Strait of Dover, 100 miles or more above that Allied beachhead area on the Norman coast. We have no confirmation of any invasion activity in this area from Allied headquarters as yet. But already we are expanding our beachhead there in Normandy. And in Stockholm they're saying that Denmark has said today that German troops in the protectorate there have been ordered on an invasion alert since early this morning. And General Sir Bernard Montgomery says he is pleased with the initial phases of the invasion operations. General Montgomery heads the Allied armies taking part in the landings, as you know. Montgomery was quite happy as he told newsmen today that he'd given his officers a 5-point recipe for victory just before the invasion began. The 5-point recipe for victory, Montgomery said, was this: 1, Allied solidarity; 2, offensive eagerness; 3, enthusiasm; 4, confidence; and 5, all-out effort. That's General Montgomery's 5-point recipe for victory. And in Washington, Secretary of War Stimson, with smiles on his face, told the newsmen that first reports of the Allied landings in France indicated the long-awaited invasion was going very nicely. He's the second Washington official today to say that. Admiral King, chief of our navies, and a member of President Roosevelt's strategic board, said that when he left the president this morning. And we learn now that the Nazis are suppressing news of the progress of the invasion and withholding the facts from the German people. Radio Atlantic, which is a German secret transmitter, charged in a broadcast monitored this afternoon by NBC that the German propaganda machine was letting only a trickle of news out to the German people. What scant news is put out by the German home radio is very confused and depressing, and the people of Berlin have gathered in the streets in whispering knots, wondering where the next blow will fall. They know that by nightfall and the hours of darkness now ensuing will mean more landings. Where, they ask. Their prime question is where. The clandestine transmitter, located somewhere in Germany, states all this today. It is significant, says this radio station, which is called Anti-Nazi, that though broadcasts beamed to Germany from England repeat the German claims of successes in naval engagements in the Channel, the Reich radio has made no such statements. It has not claimed that Allied ships were sunk in the Channel. The German radio people know only too well the deplorable state of their fleet. They recall the sober statement of a high Nazi naval official that they are up against the strongest fleets in the world. And in Washington, Henri Opinot, the delegate of the French Committee of National Liberation, says that French divisions soon will participate in the Battle of France and that French shock troops will help to open the road to Paris, the road from Le Havre, we suppose. Side by side with American and British divisions, French divisions armed with the magnificent material given to them by the United States soon will participate in the battle. French soldiers will fight tomorrow as they have fought in Africa and in Italy, where by the side of the Allies they opened the road to Rome. Tomorrow they will open the road to Paris. And Prime Minister Winston Churchill received today this congratulatory message from Premier Stalin of Russia of the Allied liberation of Rome. He said, "I congratulate you on the great victory of the Allied Anglo-American forces in the taking of Rome." This news has been greeted in the Soviet Union with great satisfaction. Those are the words of Premier Stalin. And the Berlin radio reports tonight that big air battles have developed over Romania today between Nazi fighters and bombers of the Allied Mediterranean Air Force. Soon we may expect the Russians to be on the push there. This news is brought to you from the NBC newsroom in New York by your commentator, Don Goddard.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.